The scary part is that one of the submarines decided to launch its nuclear missile, its nuclear torpedoes at some of the American ships. And so there was a captain of the ship decided to launch them. Unfortunately, there was an information officer on board who was a political figure and prevented that from happening.
Hey guys, before we start, this is a quick reminder to check out Auxoro Premium, the best deal in premium podcasting. For $5 a month, you get bonus episodes spanning pop culture, love, science, politics, drugs, philosophy, sex, and more. You also gain access to the Unlicensed Therapy series, where I give my unexpert opinion on all things dating, sex, and relationships. Did I mention I'm unqualified? But it's also way cheaper than a real therapist, so you're welcome. On Auxoro Premium, you also get exclusive Ask Me Anything episodes, the ability to suggest topics for the podcast, and the entire back catalog of archived episodes. There's over 25 hours of premium content already posted, and it grows every month. Go to auxoro.supercast.com today. That's AUXORO.supercast.com to get all those benefits on Auxoro Premium for only $5 per month. auxoro.supercast.com to join the premium gang today. Now, on to the episode. Brian Toon, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
So, at the time of this recording, Russia is continuing its invasion of Ukraine, and thousands of soldiers have been killed on both sides. Some estimates have the Ukrainian civilian death toll at over 1,000 people. And with Putin putting Russia's nuclear forces on high alert, this is the first time Russia has raised it this high since the 1960s. People around the world are worried that the casualties may be just a drop in the bucket for what to come. So I wanted to ask you if Putin, on the very small chance that he decided to launch a nuclear strike, which subsequently opened the gates to global nuclear war, what would the consequences be for the people of the planet and the planet itself?
Sure. Well, I agree with you that it's very unlikely that Putin is going to attack anybody with nuclear weapons, because he certainly must realize it would leave Russia as a smoldering ruin, to say nothing of Europe and the United States. So Russia has a couple of different choices. It has a lot of tactical nuclear weapons, maybe as many as 2,000. And these are not controlled by treaty, so we don't know very much about them. Some of them are things like nuclear depth charges and things like that. But a lot of them are missiles that can be used to attack NATO countries in Europe. And there are lots of military bases in Europe. The United States has nuclear weapons stored in Belgium and Germany and Italy and Turkey and in Germany. So there's 5 countries with nuclear weapons stored in them, plus Britain and France have their own nuclear arsenals. All of those countries would certainly be attacked. Plus, there are lots of targets that are not obvious military bases, like most large airports would be attacked. Most large oil refineries would be attacked. Places that are military supporting industries would probably be attacked. So there'd be lots of targets within cities. And that's the really problem here, is that nuclear weapons are made to destroy cities. That's what they were designed to do. And if you want to destroy some small military target, then a nuclear weapon is just total overkill, because it'll, depending on the yield, destroy everything around it for many miles. So anyway, that would be the least dangerous thing to do, is use tactical weapons on Ukraine or Europe.
That's the least destructive option, is if Russia used these tactical nuclear weapons. Do they tend to be smaller? The tactical ones you said, they're not the most powerful nuclear weapons on the planet, but we don't keep track of them as much as we do the bigger ones.
Well, we only fail to keep track of them just because the treaties have been written not to consider them. And there are some that are smaller, but there's no difference between a tactical weapon and a strategic weapon, except that tactical ones are usually used to fight in a battlefield condition rather than being long-range attacks against the enemy cities. So, Putin could use a weapon like that in Ukraine. to attack some military target. And he might do that just to demonstrate his sincerity in threatening people with nuclear weapons. This was a concern during the Trump administration, because the Trump administration put a lot of low-yield nuclear weapons on submarines, and a lot of people were worried that their goal was to use a nuclear weapon on something so that they could break the taboo against their use. Why anybody would want to do that is not clear. But at any rate, that was thought to be a possibility in the Trump administration. But if we really got into a nuclear war, the most likely way for that to happen is because of some sort of misunderstanding or accident. In the Crimean invasion, the Russians shot down an airliner, and that was certainly unnecessary. One could imagine that some terrorist group decides to sink an American aircraft carrier. The Iranians could certainly do that if they wanted to, or some other attack took place, or someone thought there was an attack. It's a possibility some hacker would think it would be amusing to go in and make people think there was an attack. This happened a couple of years ago, you might remember, when North Korea was threatening the United States with nuclear weapons. And somebody broadcast a radio message in Hawaii saying that Hawaii was under attack and take shelter. And, of course, terrified the people in Hawaii, because it seemed perfectly plausible given the warnings from North Korea. And so you could have someone make some dumb error like that and make people think their country was under attack.
Yeah, I was reading about their top generals that have gone on record that have said if there is a nuclear war, it will most likely be sparked by some sort of accident. That's the most likely cause of one right now, that it's some miscommunication, or I've even seen reflection of sunlight showing up as a nuclear missile heading towards somewhere. And I didn't understand before preparing for this podcast how much the extreme lack of time that world leaders are given to possibly launch a counter-nuclear attack within 20, 30 minutes. And they have to decipher all this information, 6 or 7 dozens of different options possibly of what it could be, and then make the decision whether or not to press that button.
Exactly. That's the problem, is that the president of the United States, as well as the leader of Russia, will have a military person follow them around with the launch codes for their countries. And it takes about 30 minutes for missiles from those two countries to travel across to the other country. It takes a while to detect a launch, to tell that information to the president, so they, would end up with tens of minutes at most to decide whether they were going to believe the information and end Western civilization and perhaps kill most of the people on the planet by launching their own weapons, or whether they were going to assume it was a mistake. And we did have a case where this went all the way up to the president of the Soviet Union, who I believe at the time was Brezhnev, who was a famous drunk. So one worries having one person have the authority by themselves to launch these missiles, extremely, extremely dangerous. And it's getting...
Yeah, I even saw, I was going to say, I even saw a rumor of Richard Nixon being drunk at the time when he could have possibly raised our nuclear alert system and launched a strike, and his generals urged him to wait until he sobered up. That could be something that's just folklore, but it doesn't sound that far off from the other accidents that I've read about, or other almost accidents.
Well, people were worried about Nixon launching a nuclear strike. I don't think he ever came close to doing that, from anything I've ever heard. But people are also worried about Donald Trump doing it. So there are concerns about the mental stability of some of these people and the situation they're in, and they have the sole authority to launch a strike. And even though the military says, "Oh, well, we could stop them," they couldn't without disobeying their owes and what they're trained to do. The real concern here is a short period of time, but also in the past, most of these near accidents have been caused because they put a new detection system into place. That's what happened with the reflections from clouds. Russians had just put up a new launch detection system. And so this is an increasing concern because, for example, Putin doesn't like the United States missile defense systems, which he thinks could prevent him from attacking the U.S., which, of course, the missile defense system has almost no capability of doing anything except spending taxpayer money. So
there's no point to the missile defense system, really?
As far as I know, there's no evidence that it works. They have done various tests of it where they launch a missile and at a known time, and it has ways of being found by the interceptor, and even then it doesn't work very well, and there's no way it's going to detect a launch, and all the decoys are be used to decoy away defenders that would actually work. But we have a dangerous situation going on here because Russia in particular is concerned about those defense systems, and so it wants to build offensive systems that even have less warning. For example, they've talked about using hypersonic gliders. It takes longer for a hypersonic glider to actually get to its target than a regular missile. But the way it does it is a regular missile goes high up into space, so you can see it pretty easily. But a hypersonic glider is like a cruise missile. It goes near the surface, so it's very hard to pick up on a radar, and so it can sneak up on you. You have also other things that they're planning to do, like a year or two ago, something blew up in northern Russia and killed a bunch of people, which was almost certainly a nuclear-powered cruise missile. So the idea there is you have these flying drones, and they're powered by nuclear engines, so they can fly around for years at a time. And so you got these flying around in the atmosphere all the time, and anytime you suddenly decide to, you just direct them to attack your enemy, which of course would have no warning again. And then the Russians have what are thought to be drone submarines, which they threaten to put very large weapons on and sail into American ports and then blow up the city around the port. And so that's also something they've warned of. So the danger there...
So it's basically... Go ahead.
A real danger there is that because there's so little warning, you turn over your detection systems to artificial intelligence. So now you've got a computer that's going to decide that there's an attack going on and whether a response should be made. And, we all know that computers are susceptible to hackers, and they're almost certainly going to have some kind of problem in their system that we didn't anticipate. So it's incredibly dangerous to ever let computers decide whether you're going to kill everybody on the planet. For all we know, the computers will decide they don't like us and do it on purpose.
Yeah, exactly. What if the computers decide to band together and actually make us think there's a nuclear attack when there isn't, because it's in their own best interests, and they all get in their little robot bunkers and they come out and humanity's gone.
Right. Probably.
So it sounds like it's basically it's a game of building up your nuclear arsenal and decreasing the delivery time of those nuclear weapons. So you want them to be undetectable, and you want it to be a very short time to when it eventually blasts the other country or city, wherever you're aiming it at. And at the same time, you have to build up detection systems to match that. And then when you bring new detection systems online, that's when there's the highest chance of a fuck up, a mess up, something like that.
Yes, that's certainly true, and that's the situation we're kind of in now. That's not the situation we've been in previous to this. And so what happened between the invention of nuclear weapons in 1945, first use, first nuclear war, and up until about the Trump administration. We had treaties of various types. Between 1945 and 1986, there was a rampant buildup of nuclear weapons. So at that time, in 1986, there were 70,000 nuclear weapons on the planet. 70,000. So the United States has only got 300 cities with more than 100,000 people in it. And Russia only has 200 cities with more than 100,000 people in it. Why do you need 70,000 weapons? Even now, Russia has, I mentioned the 2,000 tactical weapons, but Russia and the United States between them have somewhere around 11,000 nuclear weapons. Some of them are being dismantled, but 2,000 in Russia and 2,000 in the United States are called deployed strategic weapons, and another 2,000 are in storage somewhere so they can be brought out in a tense situation. So Russia has between 2,000 and 4,000 nuclear weapons it could use against the U.S. Without even thinking of the 2,000 tactical weapons. So there are 300 cities in the United States with more than 100,000 people. They got at least 2,000 deployed weapons. So that means you can attack every city in the United States with 7 nuclear weapons. Most 100,000 population of cities don't have that many targets. It only takes one nuclear weapon to destroy the whole city. Why do they need all those weapons? So what happened in 1986 was, a group of people that I worked with, and that included Carl Sagan, discovered that if you use these nuclear weapons, you would cause what's called a nuclear winter. And the idea there is that the nuclear weapons are meant to destroy cities. You blow one up in a city, and it's going to burn the city to the ground. A nuclear winter, a nuclear weapon is like taking pieces of the sun and bringing it down to the surface of the earth. The sun is making energy from nuclear fusion. And so you bring something bright like that to the ground, it makes a big flash of light, and that can start fires. It also makes blast waves. It can knock down buildings, which can also make fires by opening up gas lines and things. And of course, there's a pulse of radioactivity there that can kill people.
Yeah. So let's say Putin launches a tactical nuclear weapon at one of Ukraine's military facilities, and then that ignites a global nuclear war where other cities are at risk of a direct blast. So let's say, I'm in Brooklyn right now, so I'm about 5 miles away from Midtown Manhattan. Could you walk me through, if Putin launched a nuclear missile and it hit Midtown Manhattan, how would people die at ground zero? So from the actual blast and when things are going out further and further from direct impact to 1 mile, 2 mile, 3 miles, how are people actually dying at ground zero?
Sure. Well, there's a web-based game, if you want to call it a game, that you can play called Nuke Map, Nukemap. So you can pick whatever city you want and put a missile down wherever you want, and it'll show you how many people die and of what. But basically, if you have a weapon that's 100 kilotons, for example, which is 6 or 7 times as powerful as one that fell on Hiroshima, then there's a short distance near ground zero, maybe 1 kilometer wide or something like that, in which you would die of radiation coming from the bomb when it exploded, nuclear radiation. And out to maybe 5 kilometers or 4 kilometers from ground zero, there'd be strong blast waves. Further in, they could knock down big concrete buildings, and at the extremity, they could knock down brick buildings and typical wooden houses and things like that. And then outside that, going out to about 6 kilometers, you light fires. And so that whole region would have fires in it, and the whole region would have blast waves out to 5 kilometers, and the radiation is on the inside part. So if you were within 6 kilometers of a 100 kiloton weapon, which is the smallest weapon that the United States has on a submarine, there are lots of bigger ones, and the area that's covered is sort of proportional to the yield. So if you go up to a megaton bomb, the area covered is 10 times bigger. So you're talking about hundreds of square kilometers being destroyed by one bomb, which is why you can destroy a whole city of moderate size with one weapon. So this would be, well, in Hiroshima, for example, not everyone died in Hiroshima that was within the damaged area. If you were right in the center, you did probably die from radiation poisoning. But a little further out, there were buildings were being knocked down, but didn't kill everybody to knock the building down. Some people escaped. The Hiroshima damage is mostly caused by fires. There was a big firestorm that started that just burned all the fuel and released 1,000 times as much energy as the bomb did. So there's much more energy released burning cities than there is in the bombs. And people ran from the fire as best they could, and it wasn't a very big bomb. They only had to run about 1 kilometer to get away from the fire. And so if you have a small weapon or you live very at the edge of the whole thing, you may be able to run away from the fire. If you're in the center, you're not going to run away from the fire.
Yeah. So if you're right in the impact zone, you basically have no chance. And then if you're outside of that, there's a good chance you get third-degree burns. You just, everything's on fire. You can't really do anything about it unless you have a plan or something like that. But even if you did have a plan, I imagine you're pretty fucked.
Well, you might get lucky because it takes like in Hiroshima, it took 3 hours for the fire to really develop. So what happens initially is you start little fires all over the place. And, so if you run at that point, you might have a chance of getting out before the fires consume everything. This is actually something important for people to know just about everyday life. It used to be 10 or 15 years ago that if a fire started in your house, you had 4 or 5 minutes to get out of the house, your apartment, before you had what's called a flashover. And in a flashover, the temperature in the inside becomes so warm that all of a sudden, the flames just flash across the whole dwelling and burn everything. So you used to have about 5 minutes or so to get out of your house. But now you only have like 1 minute to get out of your house before flashover occurs. And that's because modern houses are full of so much plastic these days and other synthetics, which are all incredibly flammable. So if your fire alarm goes off, you should get up and get out of your house as fast as you can. You don't have time to think about it.
If you did manage to, so let's say for me, I'm 4 or 5 miles away. Is that about 12 kilometers, something like that, from the center of Manhattan? 4 or 5 miles?
5 kilometers is 3 miles, something like that.
Okay, so if let's say I was 5 kilometers away from the center of impact in Midtown. Even if I survived the initial blast, I didn't get crushed by a building or something like that, would I be killed within 2 or 3 weeks by radiation poisoning? Would running give me a fighting chance, or would it basically be a ticking clock until I succumb to radiation?
Sure. So this is people's main fear, it seems, is radiation because they can't see it. And so they don't know if it's there. So there's 2 kinds of nuclear attacks. There's air bursts and ground bursts. So if you have an air burst, the weapon explodes high over the city, maybe half a mile above the city, depending on the yield of the weapon. And that's the preferred thing from the nuclear planner point of view because it does the most damage. You have the point way above the city and the blast wave covers the largest area. So more people will die in that kind of an attack. However, if you're after some target that's buried, like a missile silo, like where I live, 50 miles north of me, there's 50 nuclear weapons sitting in the ground on the top of missiles. Totally unnecessary, huge waste of money. All it does is put a target on the country. They should get rid of them, save the money, and spend it on something useful. But nevertheless, if you wanted to attack those missile silos, they have big concrete covers on them, you'd want to use a ground burst. And the importance of a ground burst is that when the explosion occurs, it picks up all kinds of dirt from the ground, which is kind of heavy. That you take sand, you throw it in the air, it falls right back down. So the nuclear weapon would pick up all this dirt from the ground, and the radiation from the bomb attaches itself to that dirt. And then the dirt, it doesn't fall down in seconds because it'd be lifted fairly high, but it falls down as the wind blows it downwind. It will fall down in some like pencil-shaped pattern downwind and drop radiation within that pattern. So if you're upwind of the blast on the ground, you're probably not going to get that radiation affecting you. But if you're downwind and it falls on you, that radiation can kill you. And so the best thing to do is, if you're ways downwind, is to go to your basement or stay in some kind of closed area, where you're not exposed to the air outside and radiation can't get into your house. Because that radiation has a pretty short lifetime. It's only dangerous for a few days. So if you give it a few days, then you can leave safely probably and go somewhere that, to go get some food or something like that. So that's...
Yeah. I was reading that the radiation basically drops off a cliff after, like you said, 2 days, and then after 2 weeks, I believe it's 1% of what it initially was, depending on the size of the bomb.
So it drops off very rapidly.
I was gonna say you could tell me if I'm wrong, but my best bet, I would, grab. Hopefully I would have a bag ready to go if it was a real threat up to that point for New York City to be bombed. Maybe the alerts got raised, and then I would run to the nearest underground subway station and try to chill there, wait it out till hopefully, maybe someone has a radioactive detector where we could see the levels. But if not, just wait for a few days and then go test it out. Does that sound right, or is that completely
off? I
wouldn't
pick a subway station because they're well ventilated, and they'd probably be bringing in outside air to ventilate the subway, depending on whether there's any power left, which probably there wouldn't be. So you couldn't really know that in a place like that that you would be safe from radiation leaking in from the outside. You'd be better off in your apartment or your basement or someplace you knew you could seal it off so that there wasn't fresh air coming in. You'd have to have been lucky and have a little food stored in your house or something like that. And the power would go out, so you might have trouble cooking anything. The real problem here is not, though, these attacks on cities. The real problem comes because when you burn these cities, it produces a huge amount of smoke. And the smoke, like in Hiroshima, there was it's called a pyrocumulus. You might have heard of these because a pyrocumulus is a thunderstorm created by a fire. And there have been some of these that have occurred in the last couple of years, big forest fires in British Columbia and Australia. Anyway, the one over Hiroshima went up to about 16 kilometers. And the importance of that is that at 16 kilometers, the smoke is going into the stratosphere, which is, we live in what's called the troposphere, which means overturning. There's a lot of convection and turning motion and a lot of rainfall. The stratosphere is stratified. And so when you put something in the stratosphere, it never rains up there. In fact, the humidity is only a few percent. And so you put all that smoke in the stratosphere, and it's going to stay there for a couple of years and quickly spread across the planet because the smoke is heated by the sun. The smoke is black from carbon, black carbon it's called, and the sun will heat that and it will rise. We've actually seen this. In 2017, there was a huge fire in British Columbia. But smoke in the stratosphere, the sun shone on it, it rose up to 20 kilometers. And there was this Australian fire in 2019, 2020, right there in the end of December. And that smoke went up to 30 kilometers. So this has been predicted by models of what's called nuclear winter for decades, but never observed until very recently. Anyway, so this smoke would rise very high and go global. It would be globally distributed. Probably within a month, it would be all the way to Antarctica. And this is where you really have problems, because the amount of smoke that we think would be produced by burning the cities in Russia and the United States and Europe is enough to basically reduce sunlight at the surface by about 70%.
And this is you said nuclear winter.
Right. So you reduce sunlight by 70%, and the temperatures would drop within weeks below freezing. And in the models that we've used, it doesn't get above freezing in places like Iowa or the Ukraine, which are breadbaskets of the world, for a couple of years. So you're not going to grow anything in the normal growing regions for several years. There can just be snow on the ground and freezing temperatures for years on end.
So I was saying in regards to nuclear winter, we got into the ground zero deaths, but non-ground zero deaths, which you were describing. You wrote a paper with Alan Robach called Self-Assured Destruction, the Climate Impacts of Nuclear War. And you said modern climate models not only show that nuclear winter theory is correct, but also that the effects would last for more than a decade because of an unexpected phenomenon, which is smoke. So when scientists like yourself, they talk about not only the millions of people at risk from ground zero, but non-ground zero deaths, this would mainly come from the smoke accumulation and then the smoke rising above the stratosphere and changing the entire globe, like transportation, energy, agriculture, things like that, like billions of people literally at risk.
Right. So one contrast you can make is that an American Ohio-class submarine carries about 96 Trident missiles. And each of those missiles has multiple warheads that are more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. So one submarine has about 1,000 times the destructive potential of the Hiroshima bomb. So 100,000 people got killed by the Hiroshima bomb, roughly. And so that implies 100 million people could get killed by the missiles on one submarine by the direct effect of the explosions and the radiation. So that's what the military considers to be the damage that would be done by that one submarine. It's 100 million people. That's, of course, that's a lot of people.
Yeah, that's just that's direct. You said that's not even including the aftermath with nuclear winter.
Right. So that's called assured destruction by the military, meaning they have a lot of confidence that those effects actually occur and would kill people. However, the nuclear winter, which the military thinks of as collateral damage, meaning it's not their fault, wasn't what they planned. They planned assured destruction. Collateral damage is, oh, well, that happened. We weren't really thinking about that. Too bad.
Yeah.
And so in nuclear winter, we have some new calculations we're working on or just about to publish, in which we evaluated for every country in the world the agricultural losses that would occur because of the climate changes from the smoke. So the smoke blocks sunlight, it gets cold. Plants don't like it when it's below freezing, and they don't like it when there's not very much sunlight either. And so you can compute with agricultural models what the effect of this would be on all these different countries. And some countries are affected very badly by this kind of thing, like Russia, for example, because it's at a high latitude. It's already pretty cold. And this makes it worse. At any rate, what we find is that a war between India and Pakistan, now we're talking countries with maybe 250 nuclear weapons each in the middle of this decade.
So these are considered smaller nuclear powers, India and Pakistan.
A much smaller nuclear power, India and Pakistan. That India and Pakistan, depending on the yield of their weapons, which we don't know because there's no treaties controlling them, We think that they could kill between 1 and 3 billion people.
Jesus. So that's a, I use the term local or regional nuclear war, but obviously it's not local or regional because it affects the entire globe. But so just a regional quote unquote nuclear conflict between India and Pakistan that has the potential to kill up to 3 billion people. That's wild.
That's right. That's wild. And a war between the United States, Europe, and Russia, we think could kill in the range of 5 or 6 billion people, which is most of the population on the planet. So there'd just be mass starvation is what's happening. The agriculture fails and people starve. And people don't realize the amount of food on the planet. And, there's a story in the Bible, which is also a story in the Quran, in which Joseph, who's kind of a troublemaker, is in prison in Egypt. He didn't come from Egypt, came from another country. Anyway, he's in jail there, and the Pharaoh is having bad dreams. So the Pharaoh's dreaming about 7 fat cows and 7 sick cows, and he has no idea what this means. He's asking around, nobody knows what it means, and somehow or other, it seems really improbable, he finds out that Joseph has been interpreting people's dreams in prison, and he knows what dreams mean. So the Pharaoh asks Joseph what it means. And he says, this means there's going to be 7 good years, 7 years of good harvest, and then 7 years of bad harvest. And so you should store grain to feed the Egyptian population. So the Pharaoh does this, and of course he's a hero Pharaoh because he saved the Egyptians from this devastating famine, and all the countries around him suffered from it. So anyway, that story is not the modern world. Right now there's about 60 days, 60 days of storage of grain on the planet. And there's only enough food to feed everybody on the planet for 60 days if you stop growing new food. So if there's not agriculture going on in 60 days, people are starving to death. And there's not much you can do about it. The same thing is people don't realize how cities work. In most cities, there's enough food in the city for less than a week of supporting people without new transport into the city. So you can imagine in a war, that transportation is going to stop. You're not going to have oil refineries running. You're not going to be power. The temperature is going to drop. It's going to be cold. And, there's not going to be anything to eat pretty soon because the people that survive will only have food for a short period of time. Yeah. And we see this happening. This happened in Boulder about 10 years ago now. There was a winter storm near Christmas. And my wife, of course, had paid no attention to my comments about nuclear winter before that. But pretty soon, after a couple of days, nobody could get in, and all the supermarkets were empty, and our relatives couldn't come for Christmas. And, so that was a vivid illustration of this actual food supply problem. And, same thing happened in Seattle about the same time, and the mayor got fired because people were running out of food.
Yeah. The one positive, it seems like, of a nuclear winter is that it'll make us wish for a pandemic again and want to go back in time and be like, remember how easy it was when we just had those supply chain disruptions, and compared to what the people were going through and compared to what the planet was going through with disruptions, it sounds like the pandemic supply chain and the people losing their jobs, people not able to feed themselves, which is already bad enough, would pale in comparison to a nuclear war, nuclear winter.
Absolutely. And of course, in a nuclear war, you can see already in the pandemic that the hospital system's overrun by just a modest number of people getting seriously ill. In a nuclear war, there aren't many hospitals left. They're all going to be destroyed in the blast. Well, probably a few left somewhere in the rural areas. And, the people they're going to be dead bodies all over the place. It's going to be horrible diseases and things spreading like that, and, no sanitation. So, it would be very unpleasant there as far as human health goes, too. And, of course, there's all kinds of people that have bad burns and radiation poisoning and damage from buildings falling on them.
Yeah, I would be curious to see how nuclear war would be politicized, because we've seen during the pandemic where just wearing a mask or not wearing a mask makes you Democrat or Republican. I'm curious to see how people cover themselves during a nuclear war, nuclear winter, would make people make assumptions about how you vote. It's a non-issue, but just seeing everything that's happening right now, it's kind of hilarious to think about that if a nuclear winter did happen, it would be like 5 minutes until it became political.
Well, it's already political, just the suggestion that this would happen. And so there's a kind of an interesting history of this that didn't work the way you might think. And so when we discovered this in the early 1980s, Carl Sagan was one of the people working at it, and he had a large audience of people that listened to what he had to say. So he was able to go and communicate with people in Congress and things like that. And by 1986, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, who was then the president of Russia, Soviet Union at the time, had meetings, and they decided to put some treaties in place to limit nuclear weapons. And Ronald Reagan beforehand said, well, the scientists have been telling me about nuclear winter, and I understand it's like this volcano that caused a year without a summer in 1815. And so I think, there's something to this, and we should really get rid of these nuclear weapons. And Mikhail Gorbachev said, oh, well, Russian and American scientists have told me about the problems of using these nuclear weapons, and as people of morality, we have to do something about this and get rid of them. And so Reagan and Gorbachev agreed on these treaties to start getting rid of weapons. And every American president since then has built down the arsenals, and every Russian or Soviet president has reduced their arsenals. There's plenty of weapons left. They're not gone, but they've all reduced them. And you might be surprised that the people who have reduced the arsenals the most have been Republican presidents. So
that is surprising.
First Bush, the two Bushes made the largest reductions in nuclear weapons. This is just one of these weird political things in our country. If the Republicans are seen as big supporters of the military, so if they want to reduce weapons, nobody complains. And the Democrats try to do it. Everybody screams that they're a bunch of pansies who don't want to protect the country. So this makes no sense, but that's the way that is.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's also a whole group of people that there's a famous Harvard writer named Naomi Oreskes who wrote a book called The Merchants of Doubt, which starts off with people trying to ban cigarettes because they cause lung cancer. And, there was huge resistance to that by some people claiming that didn't happen. They didn't cause lung cancer, which everybody knows is not true. They do cause lung cancer. And then those same people then got on to nuclear winter, saying, oh, it was all a hoax, and we were all Russian communist dupes, and the Russians were just playing us, trying to reduce nuclear arsenals. And then it went on from there with the same exact people complaining about global warming. That's all a hoax. It isn't going to happen, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole group of people that, want to claim that all these problems that scientists discover and warn people about, are made up or some kind of a hoax or something. And what their motivations are is hard to understand exactly. But, a lot of them make money out of that.
Yeah, I was just listening to a podcast on the Lex Friedman show, and he was having a conversation with a guest who had studied the tobacco industry, and they were both talking about how cigarette marketing worked and how these cigarette executives actually viewed and they viewed the population as kind of just people to try things on, and they weren't actually people. And the way that they went about it legally is to provide the cigarettes. They're just the makers of the product, and then the people are the ones that are giving themselves cancer because no one's forcing them to use cigarettes. And of course, there are things like addiction. You can take advantage of certain populations of people with marketing and manipulation. And it sounds like there's a parallel between the cigarette industry and the nuclear war industry, nuclear power, where you said generals consider the billions of people that could be affected as collateral damage, almost like it's not our fault. We just launched the nukes. The planet is the one that's killing all these people.
Well, yeah, and I think in their case, I mean, I've met a number of generals and admirals in meetings about this, and, these are very intelligent people who are very thoughtful, and, they're much more worried about wars than politicians are, who mostly have no experience with wars. So I think the ones who complain about this are mostly saying, well, my advisors told me that this was probably just not right, and therefore, if it happened, I didn't expect it to happen. So that's why it's collateral damage. It's sort of like bombing a house with Osama bin Laden in it and killing a bunch of kids. Oh, well, who knew his family was there? He was there. We had to get him. Sort of like that kind of a thing. But nevertheless, the military didn't discover nuclear winter, and they are still not doing any real research to try to understand it. It isn't like they're trying to understand the dangers of their own weapons.
All right, back from hopefully the last technical difficulty. Okay. So I wanted to ask you, from an atmospheric science standpoint, what drew you to study nuclear weapons and the effect that nuclear weapons may have on the planet? Because you could have went in a bunch of different directions. So what drew you to nuclear specifically?
Right. Well, I've worked and still work on quite a number of different things. I did a lot of work in the ozone hole. Was involved lots of expeditions to Antarctica and the Arctic to try to understand what caused the ozone hole and things like that. And I've worked on volcanoes and their effects on the climate and the greenhouse effects on Mars and Venus and exoplanets. So I worked on a lot of different things, but in the early 1980s, I worked at NASA, Ames Research Center in California, and I was working on the effects of volcanic eruptions on climate, partly because we had the Mount St. Helens eruption, and there was an eruption in Mexico called El Chichon, and they both had effects or did things to the upper atmosphere and climate. And at the time, there was also a lot of interest in building supersonic aircraft, and so there was a big effort to understand what they might do to the environment. So anyway, we had developed all these models that allowed us to simulate particles in the upper atmosphere. And in about 1981, there was a group at Berkeley with the Alvarezes. Louis Alvarez is a Nobel Prize winner, and his son Walter, and a couple of other people there, who discovered that at the time when the dinosaurs became extinct, an asteroid hit the Earth. And so that was very interesting to us. So we did a bunch of studies of how could an asteroid kill all those animals and cause global extinctions. So the first thing we thought was, a huge amount of dust was put into the atmosphere. And we knew that because we could find the dust is still present as a layer over the Earth. So there's a place where it's exposed in southern Colorado. You can go down, put your fingers on it, touch it. It's about as big as a fingernail. That's not a very thick layer, but it's about how thick it is. And so anyway, I gave a talk about that at a meeting about the extinction event. And someone said, why don't you think about nuclear wars? And I had actually thought about them already and didn't see that there was anything likely to be a problem there. But I went and called up a friend, Richard Turco, who worked for a company that was part of the RAND Corporation, studied nuclear weapons. So anyway, we talked about it, and we did some simulations with putting a lot of rocks in the atmosphere, and I could make a small climate change. And while we were thinking about it, another group in Europe, Paul Crutzen, who had a Nobel Prize, got one later in chemistry, and John Birx pointed out that, there'd be all these fires in forests following nuclear explosions. And so we thought about that a little bit, and some people which worked knew that, the cities are going to burn. And so we evaluated how much smoke would be produced from the cities, and then we decided, it's not going to be like a normal forest fire. In a normal forest fire, the smoke is rained out in a week or less. I live in Colorado here. We get smoke all the time from all these fires in California. So the smoke goes a fair distance, and it's, choking and miserable here for weeks on end in the last couple of years from all the fires in the West. But that's not going to cause a global problem. It doesn't last long enough. But the smoke from these big, huge fires in cities, which cover a vast area all at once. Forest fires are actually kind of lines of flames. They don't cover a big area. Anyway, that smoke goes into the stratosphere, and it will last for years. And so that's how we discovered, and I became interested in it, is because of the extinction of the dinosaurs. And at first we thought it was rocks, as I mentioned, but then we found it was smoke. And surprisingly enough, in the layer that marks the death of the dinosaurs, there's not only the remnants of the asteroid, but there's also a huge amount of smoke in it. And the amount of smoke there requires that everything on the surface of the planet burned. So all the forests and grasses and even stuff in the subsoil probably burned. It's an intense global fire. And it was basically caused because when the asteroid hit, it blew all these rocks back into space, and they re-entered the atmosphere as shooting stars. And so everybody's probably seen a shooting star, a little streak of light across the sky. There's a friction slowing down the little sand-sized grain, heats it up and vaporizes it, and makes a layer of hot air there. But in this case, there's 10,000 shooting stars per centimeter squared on the ground. So it's not like one shooting star an hour or something. This is like the entire sky was full of countless numbers of shooting stars. So when the dinosaurs looked up, what they probably saw was a glowing red-hot sky everywhere. And if you want to know what the dinosaurs felt, you can go to your grocery store and buy a dinosaur. Chickens and turkeys are dinosaurs. Get yourself a chicken, take it home, turn your oven on, broil. The glow bar in your broiler oven is about the same radiating temperature as this glowing sky. So people bake chickens all the time. If you bake a chicken, it doesn't burn. But if you go stick it under the broiler and leave it there for not very long, it'll burn and, get third-degree burns all over it. So that's probably what happened to the dinosaurs. They had nowhere to hide. Everything burned to the ground. But it wasn't just the dinosaurs that died. 75% of the species on the planet died. In the oceans, plankton died. And so
go ahead.
We think the plankton died because the smoke blocked the sunlight. And so it became, after these fires went out, it became as dark as a moonless night. The plankton couldn't reproduce anymore. And so they quickly died, and the fish didn't have anything to eat. They died. And so the whole food chain collapsed in the oceans. And we survived, our ancestors. So our ancestors had been on the planet as long as the dinosaurs. Mammals were not a successful group competing against dinosaurs. We were like little mice things, shrews, hid out in holes in the ground. And that's likely what saved us, is that, our ancestors were living in these little holes. So fires broke out, they ran down to the holes. That shielded them from a fire, just like it does in normal forest fires. And there's plenty to eat down there. There was roots and grubs, and so they probably got along by eating stuff from under the soil until the smoke went away and the light returned and plants could start to regrow.
So that learning about the effects of nuclear war and knowing what you know about how the dinosaurs died with the asteroid hit, that kind of made a connection to you, and you focused on nuclear war. One of the things you focused on from that point, the parallels of those two situations.
Yeah, and in the case of the nuclear wars, in science, models, are not reliable. What's reliable is to go and do an experiment. But you can't go start a nuclear war just to find out what happens. I should say that's.
I bet you one general. There are a couple of generals out there that would be for that experiment, just to see what happens.
I don't think so. I mean, if you're a general, you've seen people die. You don't want that. But I should say that that's how I got into this problem. But Carl Sagan got into it in a different way. I mean, I was one of his students, and so we started working on this and found these results. And we knew he was making Cosmos, a TV series at the time, and we knew he was interested in this problem, so we called him up and told him about it. And he, of course, obviously wanted to be involved, but his interest in it was because of what's called the Drake equation. So the Drake equation, you take the number of stars in the universe or the galaxy, and then you take the number of planets around each star, and then you figure out how likely is it for the planet to be in a habitable zone, and how likely is it for simple life to arise, how likely is intelligent life. At any rate, you can then calculate the number of intelligent civilizations in the galaxy. And so Carl did this along with Frank Drake and other people, and they found an enormous number of intelligent civilizations should be present in the galaxy. And so where are they? What's wrong here? And so it could be we just haven't detected them yet. Most of the things that they used at the time have been tested since then. Like now we know there are planets around other stars. We know how many there are, so on. So at any rate, there's still a problem here with where are they? And Carl hypothesized that when you had a young, intelligent civilization arise, it would discover nuclear power and annihilate itself. And so he thought that was what was stopping them. So he came at it from a different direction than we did. But at any rate, the dinosaur thing is important because, I already mentioned to you these big fires tell us that a prediction we made about smoke rising actually happens. And we know from volcanic eruptions, you have a volcanic eruption, it blocks sunlight from reaching the ground, it gets cold. So we know that happens. We can use the same models to simulate all these different phenomena. And so we have, for example, simulated the smoke from these fires, but that's, 0.1% of the amount of smoke you get in a nuclear war. At the other extreme, we know what happened with the dinosaurs because we can see the smoke that's there. We can put that smoke back into the atmosphere. It makes it very dark at the surface. And, it's sub-ice age temperatures. But the nuclear war cases are also sub-ice age temperatures. But the amount of smoke with the dinosaurs is about 100 times more than from a nuclear war. So we have these examples of a worse situation where mass extinctions occur and nothing much happening when we have these fires putting smoke into the stratosphere. So we have examples of what happens from nature above us and below us on the nuclear winter problem. And of course, we don't observationally quite know where the nuclear winter fits in there. It's not a tight enough constraint to really pin it down in detail, but the same models work in all those different cases.
So when you describe these models in detail to the military personnel, policymakers that you've said you've interacted with, you describe the world burning, the effects of nuclear winter, all the smoke above the stratosphere, it's going to stay there for years. When you say things like 1/6 of the human race may perish, what is the reaction? Is there a spectrum of reaction from military personnel? Are they willing to hear it? Do they only care about the pure strategy of war? How do they kind of take that information in?
Well, in the 1980s, as soon as we announced this, Congress immediately had the National Academy of Sciences study it, and that study said, as far as they could tell, what we'd found was correct. And there were some military leaders there who were very thoughtful. Then there was studies by the Department of Energy, that's who makes the bombs, and various people in universities. There's a very collaborative study there going on between people who had classified information about weapons and science people and various government agencies. And this is a collaborative study that went on for several years. And then finally there was the Scientific Committee on Problems in the Environment, which is a worldwide committee that involves international unions of different types of science people, and they examined it and also said that, as far as they could tell, it was fine, the theory. So there was intense work on it in the 1980s. But after 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and everybody thought peace had broken out. People start solving their problems without having to have wars. People would behave rationally instead of emotionally about some of these issues. And so, people stopped thinking about it. And, I didn't start thinking about it again until the early 2000s, when India and Pakistan started threatening each other with nuclear weapons. And, a reporter called me up and said, well, what would happen if they have a war? And, reporters usually call you up and say, I'm on a deadline to have an hour. What's going to happen if they have a war?
Yeah.
I didn't know much about India and Pakistan at the time. So I felt kind of guilty in my responding to the reporter. And it took me a couple of years, but I had enough time to go and look at it and discover how many weapons they had, which at that time was about 50 each. So I calculated how much material would burn in the Indian and Pakistani seas, which is a lot because they're densely populated. And I went and found Alan Roebuck at a meeting, who I knew was doing some volcano simulations, and said, why don't you put this in your model and see what it does? And as I say, made a significant climate change. So the Department of Energy knew about this work in Pakistan and India. They never asked us to come and give them a talk. We asked them multiple times to go and give them a talk. They never invited us to come and give a talk. So there was no interest within the military.
What was the change from the 1980s all the way to the 90s, 2000s? Because it seems like the military personnel, world leaders, were much more receptive to taking caution and hearing what scientists had to say with nuclear policy, at least. But what was that blockage that built up? What was the chink in the chain with communication?
Well, I think that's part of a change in society in general. In the 1980s, if there was some science problem that arose, for example, the ozone hole problem arose at about the same time as nuclear winter. And, I spent months at a time in remote places of the world, flying airplanes around with instruments and huge numbers of people trying to understand the ozone hole. So society responded almost instantly to that and to look into it. I had probably thousands of scientists worked on the ozone hole. But with a nuclear war, there were never very many people that worked on it. The government wouldn't fund anybody to work on it. There's people didn't want to work on it because they were afraid of the military. So most scientists don't want to work on this problem because, they're afraid of the military. There's a huge...
What is that fear? What are they afraid the military is going to do? They're going to manipulate the data or something? Or where does that fear come from?
Well, I think the fear, from this point of view of an individual scientist, I mostly work with graduate students. I have to pay for the graduate students. Lots of graduate students go to grad school and I think, the university's giving me money, to study whatever I'm studying, and isn't that nice? Well, that's just not what's happening. The university doesn't give them any money. The faculty have to go out and get money from the federal government to do research. And there's no money to study nuclear wars. There's no agency, the federal government, that supports any research on nuclear conflict. And between, mid-1980s, when what funding there was ended, and the last 3 or 4 years, there was no funding at all to study it. Alan and I and other people just had to do this, on our own time. And then, right now, there are all these wealthy entrepreneurs who want to use their money for something useful. And so we're supported now from what's called the Open Philanthropy Project, which is funded by some of the original founders of Facebook. And so that's actually allowed us to get together enough people and agricultural modeling and other things to do something. So
it seems like such a huge lapse for the government to be highly interested in building nuclear weapons and developing defense systems for nuclear weapons, and even getting into other ways to power the country with nuclear, and to not have a dedicated program within the government where you're pumping in millions, even billions of dollars to study the effects of nuclear, something like nuclear winter, or what's the best policy when it comes to reducing the amount of nuclear weapons, best defense systems, things like that. Even if you were for keeping the levels of nuclear weapons where they're at now, it seems like it would be in your best interest to know what it's going to do to the planet and know how to properly defend yourself if there is a way to do so. It just doesn't make sense to have this as a huge outlet and not study it.
That's correct, but a lot of the stuff in the government doesn't make much sense. And so what's happening in this case is that, if you're a manager of some agency like the National Science Foundation or NASA, it's not your job to go investigate nuclear weapons. And so you're not going to suddenly start funding people to do that. I've seen firsthand, I expected when this problem came up that NASA would be interested in it because it had parallels with their problems. So I went back to NASA headquarters and said, we're about to give this talk about this thing. And basically it said, look, here's how this works. If some new project comes up and we want to put resources into it, they don't give us new resources. We have to take them from something else. So if we start studying this problem, we'll have to take away resources from climate research or planetary science or something. So we're not going to do that. And DOD, of course, Department of Energy is not going to fund people outside the Department of Energy because, we're not under their thumb. And, I've had recent conversations. I did give a talk about it 2 years ago now at Los Alamos. They invited us to give a talk. And, there were people there that in the 1980s I had worked with on this problem. And we freely exchanged information. Everybody made a lot of progress. But now when they publish a paper on it, it's contentless. It says something as a result. But you can't tell what exactly they did or what model they used. They classified it all. So I think, there's a sort of high level of concern in those agencies for security. And so they will no longer communicate, or at least that's what they're using for an excuse. So there's issues like that. And, I think to some extent, this isn't something they want to hear about. There's a huge amount of money involved in this. And in fact, this is a problem in the Obama administration. Obama produced a new treaty with the Russians to control the number of nuclear weapons, which wasn't very different than the one that the Bush administration had. But because he was a Democrat, in order to do that, the Republicans in the Congress required him to put hundreds of billions of dollars into rebuilding the nuclear weapons in the United States. And so that's a lot of money. I don't think that those people who are receiving that money really want it to be questioned. And for example, we've asked the National Academy of Sciences in the United States many times to do a study of this. They've never agreed to do it. They're funded by Congress, and they were started by the Lincoln administration, the Civil War, to provide advice to the government. So the government has to tell them what to study, sort of. And Congress supposedly passed a requirement a year or two ago for the National Academy to have a new study of this problem, which has never happened. So there is.
To go back to the 1980s for a second. So you were part of a team, you said, with Richard Turco and Carl Sagan that discovered the nuclear winter effect?
Yeah, there was a group of people. So Turco and I started this, as I mentioned, and we did a bunch of work on it, and we could see there was something there. So then we asked Tom Ackerman to be part of it, who's a professor at the University of Washington now.
And that was a big part of the reason why Gorbachev and Reagan decided to eventually agree to end the Cold War was from your team and the discovery of the nuclear winter, and they were receptive to that.
Absolutely. And, I think it's hard to tell how big of a role Carl played in that. He's probably played a very big role just because he was produced the most distributed science book ever distributed. His Cosmos series, and he wrote in Parade magazine, and he was regularly on television programs and things like that. So people knew who Carl was.
Yeah,
he had a big ability to communicate to people in the Congress. If you look,
did you directly present the information to Gorbachev or Reagan? How did they get the information? Was it like a PowerPoint or something? Did you call them? Did they just get sent it? How did that work?
Well, when we first discovered this, we decided to give a talk at the American Geophysical Union, which has a meeting in San Francisco every December. So Rich Turco went to give a talk there, and on the day he decided to give the talk, the director of the NASA Center there said, "You can't give that talk. I forbid you to talk about it." So we had to withdraw the talk, even though it didn't work for us.
Why?
And so their claim was, well, we hadn't had it reviewed, and therefore shouldn't be presented. Of course, there were probably 1,000 other people there from NASA that likewise hadn't had their talks reviewed. At any rate, so they thought So this is, I don't know, maybe no one else ever hears of the Peter Principle anymore, but there was a book in the 1980s called the Peter Principle. And, one of the ideas in the Peter Principle is, why is it when you go to get your driver's license, if there's anything weird there, the guy behind the counter won't do anything about it? And the Peter Principle is that if you're a middle manager and someone below you does something that might be controversial, if you allow it to be done, you could get in trouble with your bosses. If you block it, you won't get in trouble. And so this guy's a middle manager. Ronald Reagan at the time had just finished destroying the Environmental Protection Agency, which never really recovered. And so he was terrified that Ronald Reagan would come in and shut down his NASA center. And so he didn't want us to work on this problem. And in fact, at one point, he called me in. I was in my early 30s, and he said, "I'm going to fire you and everybody in your building if you keep working on this problem." But I didn't pay attention to him. I was young and naive at the time. I didn't think he'd do anything, and he didn't do anything actually, but he didn't. You've probably heard the phrase steam coming out of his ears. This is
fuming. Yeah. All talk, no walk. Wouldn't actually do anything about it.
It's mostly mad. He was so mad his face was bright red and he looked like steam was coming out of his ears, trying to prevent us from working on this. At any rate,
he was going nuclear.
At any rate, they expected to just do some little internal review and stop us. But Carl said, "Oh, they want to have a review." Okay. So we had a document we'd written called the Blue Book. And we sent copies of it all over the world to science people, invited them to a meeting. And we invited people from Russia. So Gira Senchikov, who works now in Saudi Arabia, is Russian, and another fellow named Alexandrov were in Russia, and they got a copy of this. And they reproduced the results with Russian climate models. And so at this meeting, which had, I don't know exactly the right number, but certainly more than 100 people at it from all kinds of different climate groups around the world. We showed them the results and how we got it, and they all thought about it and said, yeah, there's nothing wrong. We can see here, it seems okay. And so we had it reviewed that way. And of course, NASA insisted on an internal review as well, which didn't do anything except you can't use the word war in your paper. You can't call it a war or a conflict. And so we had to change the title to Nuclear Winter instead of Nuclear War.
Does war take the budget away from NASA? Is that why they were so against having something like this published or studied?
They were afraid that would happen. In actual fact, this went up at one point to the director of NASA, and the director of NASA Ames hypothesized that the director of NASA didn't want us to work on this. So Carl called up the director of NASA, and he said, I don't care if you work on it, go ahead, fine with me. And, so there was a lot of middle manager hypotheses that they get into trouble with their management. And so they wanted to not use a word like war. They might get into trouble for that.
Just listening to you describe this, it sounds like the science community can be very zero sum. Like if you start working on something, that means I might not get the budget for it. Your work is going to take away from me somehow. Is that correct in some ways?
Well, you never know what some manager above you might do. You see this all the time in science. There's stuff like that going on now in various ways. Science matters to people sometimes. But at any rate, we're just in a situation now in the last decade where it seems that science has become political, and lots of people want to think that there's truth and truthiness or something. There are in fact facts. There are things that are real. Nature doesn't really care if we think something is not true when in fact it is true. But nevertheless, the ability of science people to get politicians to pay attention to problems, is a lot less than it used to be. We're facing. You can see a couple of very interesting things going on. Like right now, Russia, in my mind, is a state that's moving to become a failed state. So like North Korea is a failed state. Its population is starving to death, and all they do is invest money in their military. Russia has a population about half as big as the United States. Its economy is almost totally dependent on oil and raw material exports. It doesn't make anything useful. Like Obama said, Russia's a small country, and it doesn't make anything anybody wants. So Russia's investing in its military rather than building up its economy and, having its people become entrepreneurial and inventive. And there's plenty of entrepreneurial Russians. They're all living in the United States now or some other place in Europe. And so that's a state that's on the way to be a failure. This is going to be terrible problems in coming decades because they have this huge military and they're going to feel threatened continuously because their economy is failing because they're not investing in their economy. So that's an ongoing problem. That's along the same lines. And the same thing is true with global warming. We have to do something about global warming because all these fossil fuels are going to drive the temperature of the planet up. And people don't understand the time constants involved in this. So it takes a long time for the Earth to respond. So even what we've already put in the atmosphere, the Earth hasn't fully responded to. So it's going to get even warmer even if we don't do anything further, it's still going to get warmer. And the other problem is that these fossil fuels produce carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide, when you put it in the atmosphere, will remain there for tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years. It doesn't go away. This is the same problem with the ozone hole. We had some really useful industrial gases there. They were not toxic. They were incredibly useful for making air compressors and refrigerator foams and stuff. But they had long lifetimes, so they grew and grew in the atmosphere, and then all of a sudden they were destroying the ozone layer. CO2 is the same way. You put a little bit in, it's going to hang there forever. It just keeps accumulating. And, it's the amount of carbon dioxide that the average person in the United States puts in the atmosphere is a lot.
Yeah.
If you just try
I wanted to go back to the presentation for a second that you gave, because I sidetracked us a little bit. So once you gave that presentation, how did that information get presented to Reagan and Gorbachev? Were they actually present for some of these presentations, or that one? Was it their staff presented to them? How did the information, to the best of your knowledge, get into their heads where they understood, like, okay, if we do this, the entire planet is screwed?
It takes the same path, took the same path then that it does now. And the science community, an idea comes up, they communicate that into the agency they work for. Then there are probably probably studies of it by some larger group. And then it works its way up the chain of information until it gets to the politicians at the top. And, so it's not like people go and talk to the president. He's a pretty busy guy.
Yeah.
He has lots of stuff to do.
Yeah.
So you really have to go influence science advisors and heads of agencies and things like that, which is what happened in the 1980s, except that Carl actually did give a number of presentations to Congress. Presentations to Congress at that time were really mostly aimed at entertainment. I've read congressional testimonies. You can see this very easily. And so they
kind of like now. I mean, watching a lot of the congressional testimonies on YouTube can be pretty entertaining.
Yeah, absolutely. In this case, it was Carl Sagan versus Edward Teller. So they'd have Teller there at the meetings, and I did go to meetings with Teller, and I had talked to Teller myself. But, Teller and Carl would have debates in Congress, and the Congress thought this was very amusing. There had been debates about nuclear weapons ever since their invention, and the heads of the Weather Bureau in the old days had studies of how environmental things might happen because of nuclear weapons. There have been congressional hearings on it from right after the war up until the time when Carl was having hearings. And there were National Academy studies periodically of the effects of nuclear wars. So there had been one about 5 or 10 years before the nuclear winter came up. There was one when nuclear winter came up. There hasn't been one since then. It's been 40 years since the National Academy studied this. They studied it regularly until nuclear winter was discovered. Then they stopped studying. So it's very interesting.
So what was going through your head at the time when tensions were rising during the Cold War, and you're running the models for the first time back in the 80s, where you're realizing the full extent of a nuclear winter? What was going through your mind with the combination of real world tension and then knowing what the impact of the worst case scenario could be? Because I imagine it would be pretty hard to sleep.
Well, my initial thought was that this was just another science problem like volcanoes causing climate change. So I was really surprised when people were so concerned about this. In retrospect, it shouldn't have been a surprise because it involves killing everybody. But nevertheless, I was just surprised that it became such a political event. We had editorials in the Wall Street Journal saying we're communists or something like that for being concerned about this and saying nuclear wars were bad. And, I was really surprised to become the subject of an editorial in the Wall Street Journal. And there were all kinds of attacks by famous people who, for example, Freeman Dyson, who was a famous physicist, was quoted as saying, "Oh, this is all rubbish," when it came up. And so Carl called him up and said, "Well, why do you think that?" He said, "Well, I don't know. I didn't read the paper or anything. It just didn't seem right to me." Subsequently, Carl wrote a book about it, and Freeman Dyson said this was the most important thing ever done, and Carl is a superhero for having, discovered this and stuff like that in the back of his book.
Yeah, it seems like we're still headline readers today. It's just the medium that's changed.
Exactly. It takes time and effort to study something and understand it, and people shoot from the hip a lot.
So I wanted to read an example of an almost accidental nuclear strike, just to give people listening an idea of how close the calls have actually come in history. So this is an article titled "A Soviet Colonel Makes the Biggest Gamble in History" by Insider. You guys can go check it out. The full article if you want. It details 9 almost nuclear accidental strikes, and this is just one of them. So it goes: just after midnight on September 26, 1983, Soviet satellite operators at the Serpukhov 15 bunker just south of Moscow got a warning that a U.S. Minuteman nuclear missile had been launched. Later, 4 more missiles were detected. Tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union were strained earlier in the month when the Soviets shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 near Sakhalin Island, killing all 269 people on board, including U.S. Congressman Larry McDonald. The commanding officer at the bunker, Stanislav Petrov, was to inform his superiors of the launches so an appropriate response could be made. Soviet policy back then called for an all-out retaliatory strike. Knowing this, Petrov decided not to inform his superiors. He said, all I had to do was reach for the phone, raise the direct line to our top commanders, but I couldn't move. I felt like I was sitting on a hot frying pan. He recalled, he felt like I was sitting on a hot frying pan, he recalled. He reasoned that if the U.S. were to strike the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons, they would send hundreds of missiles, not just 5. But Petrov had no way of knowing if he was right until enough time had passed, by which time the nuclear bombs could have hit their target, arguably making his decision the biggest gamble in human history. After 23 minutes, Petrov's theory that it was a false alarm was confirmed, and it was later discovered that a Soviet satellite had mistaken sunlight reflecting off the top of clouds as missiles. So it's actually, you know, it's hilariously dark and scary that the world could end because, you know, someone my age, like a 28-year-old just sitting at a command center, is on a team of other people to decide what are we going to do. And 2 guys sitting next to me say, yeah. And then they're just waiting for me to give the okay. And I'm just like this is like an moment where you're just like, like, is it a nuclear missile? Is it something else? Like, I don't know, fuck it. Like, and then it could have easily just said, yeah, let's do it. So is there something to be said about how easy it is to have an accident like this that will literally could kill the entire planet, could destroy the earth eventually, and even if it doesn't get to that point, kill millions, hundreds of millions of people? Is there something to be said about how easy this process is? Like hilariously easy. This sounds like a sketch that you would see on SNL or something. And what can be done to make it a little bit harder to nuke a city?
Well, yeah, it's of great concern that accidents like this can happen. And as I mentioned before, the Soviets had just put into place a new detection system. So this is a scary thing, is that you don't want the military to start putting in new detection systems to try to prevent these kinds of first strikes. And we face the possibility now they'll do this with artificial intelligence because of the shortening response times. So the first way to solve this problem is to remove the ability of the United States president to launch a nuclear strike all by himself. We shouldn't allow one person to do that. And of course, really, there are probably lower level commanders that have the ability to do this, although they're supposed to be controlled in various ways. But having one person be able to do that is, very dangerous. The second thing we could do is to get rid of the land-based missiles on the United States. They're nothing but a waste of money. There's been scandal after scandal from the people sitting there because it's boring, and so they do things like, it takes 2 people to push the buttons. Oh, I'm going to go get a pizza. Here's a long stick. You can push my button and your button while I'm gone getting my pizza. That kind of thing happened. It can't happen now. They've found ways to control it electronically. Presumably some hacker could hack into the system if they were really motivated. It might be not that easy. But nevertheless, there's no reason to have those land-based missiles there. It's just a target in the center of the country. There's 400 of them sitting up here in Wyoming and Colorado and Montana. They're purposeless. The only reason that they're probably there is to support the economies of those states, which is not a good reason to have nuclear targets in the United States. We should just move them off to submarines or airplanes that can be recalled. Then you don't have to protect them with a short warning time. And this is not the scariest example. The scariest example is described in great detail in a recent book by Daniel Ellsberg about the Cuban Missile Crisis. What happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis is, to paraphrase his book, and he was in the Kennedy administration, so he knew in detail what happened. He's also famous for bringing down Richard Nixon with the Pentagon Papers. At any rate, what happened there was Russia was trying to move missiles into Cuba so they could reach the United States with little warning. And we didn't want that to happen. And so we set up a blockade around Cuba to prevent it from happening. And there were a number of Russian submarines there at the time. I think there were 6 of them. And we decided, it'd be fun to drive them to the surface. And so people started throwing hand grenades into the water, which to the Russians sounded like depth charges.
Yeah.
And I think 5 out of 6 of them did surface, and they all got fired for surfacing. But the scary part is that one of the submarines decided to launch its nuclear missile, its nuclear torpedoes at some of the American ships. And so there was a captain of the ship decided to launch them. But fortunately, there was an information officer on board who was a political figure and prevented that from happening. Otherwise, it would have been a nuclear war right there. And then furthermore, what happened is the Cubans were partly in control of things like anti-aircraft. They shot down an American spy plane. And unfortunately, it wasn't just these long-range missiles that were there. There were also tactical nuclear weapons there. And so had the United States decided to actually invade Cuba, which they had done, had tried a few years earlier in the Bay of Pigs, they would have been attacked by about 50 nuclear weapons in Cuba. And that would have certainly triggered a nuclear war. So there are multiple examples there that are highly parallel to the situation we're in now with Ukraine. This is why the administration is being so careful not to get sucked further into this Ukrainian thing. If you start putting NATO aircraft in there, they can be mistaken for nuclear weapons carrying aircraft. If you start shooting down Russian airplanes, that can expand the war. It's terrifying to go and read what happened in the early 1960s in this Cuban Missile Crisis, and to think about how easily that could have led to a global nuclear war. And, the parallels with that and the current situation are pretty strong.
So you mentioned getting rid of the land missiles. I wanted to ask you, let's do unrealistic changes first. So if you could wave a wand and change global nuclear policy, arsenal size, agreements, anything you wanted, however you wanted, what changes would you make? Could be unrealistic as possible.
So to be unrealistic and idealistic, I would...
Idealistic, yeah.
I would probably take Carl Sagan and said, it's just elementary planetary hygiene to get rid of all the nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have no purpose. There is nothing that they do that's useful. I'm sitting here in Colorado. They blew up 3 nuclear weapons in Colorado to see if they could produce oil from oil shale. And sure, they did produce some oil there, and some gas, but it was radioactive. For a while, they were going to use nuclear weapons to make mountain passes and things like that. Those things are just unnecessary. So there's no real reason we need nuclear weapons. In an ideal world, we just get rid of them.
So what, if you're someone like the president, or you're someone who is pro-nuclear weapons and a shit ton of them, what is the thing that someone like that thinks is useful? Like if you ask them to write down, what are your top 3 reasons for wanting these nuclear weapons? What are the reasons that most often come up?
Well, there's really only one reason, and which is mutual assured destruction. And so the idea of mutual assured destruction is that you will be afraid to attack me, because if you do, I will destroy you in return. And Alan Roebuck and I wrote a book or a paper, and Carl had already presented this kind of an idea, which is we called SAD, for self-assured destruction, which is that if you use your missiles on another country, then the smoke will come back and destroy your agricultural system and will starve to death. And Russia is especially susceptible to that. So, I think the most likely thing to happen is that we will continue the build down of nuclear weapons. This was okay until the Trump administration went in and started canceling treaties. So they canceled the treaty that Gorbachev and Reagan had put together. And that's led to the Russians building all kinds of new weapons, or maybe they had already started building them. There's some question about whether the Russians were already violating the treaty. And, so, it wasn't like they had no reason to do it, but all they did was make a huge mess by causing that treaty to go away. And they canceled the Open Skies Treaty, which allowed us to fly over Russia and photograph their facilities, and for them to fly over the United States and photograph our facilities. I think the Russians became obnoxious and flew over the Capitol or something and took a picture. So Trump canceled it, but that was really stupid.
Yeah.
Because now we can't really look at the Russian facilities in great detail. And then the Trump administration also tried to cancel the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which controls a number of weapons. And, Biden came in just before it expired and was able to continue it. So the most hopeful thing we could do out of this situation in Iran is to come up with some new treaties to drive the number of weapons down. So the practical thing to have happen, I think, is that
So this is more realistic.
The more realistic thing to have happened is to continue to reduce the nuclear arsenals. And as I mentioned, I get rid of those land-based missiles so we don't have this problem, the short warning time. And, right now there's only 200 cities in Russia with more than 100,000 people. We don't need more than a few hundred nuclear weapons to destroy Russia. We've known this since the 1950s. In the 1950s, the U.S. Department of Defense decided it could destroy 50% of Russian industrial capacity and other capacities with 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear bombs. They said, let's have 200 in case half of them fail. And, so even the military had decided long ago they only needed 200 weapons. So we have a lot bigger weapons now. But nevertheless, we could easily go down to some numbers like that, which are the same kind of numbers that China and Britain and France and India and Pakistan and Israel all have. So everybody else has decided that kind of number is reasonable. So we probably go down to that kind of a number and still, do much less damage. But nevertheless, you'd still be able to attack every city in the other country. So it could still potentially cause 1 billion people to die if there were a nuclear war. We already calculated that India and Pakistan with 250 weapons each, using only half of that arsenal, so together only use half of that they could kill between 1 and 3 billion people, depending on how big the bombs are. So we should be able to go down to those kinds of numbers, without really losing our capacity to do great damage. So the mutual assured destruction people should still feel satisfied like that. I mean, if I look at Boulder, Colorado, where I live, I can count the targets here. The National Institute of Standards, which does all the GPS satellites, here, that's a target. There's a NOAA facility here that does weather forecasting and other stuff. That's a target. There's the National Center for Atmospheric Research. That's a target. There's Ball Brothers. They build spacecraft. That's a target. There's a Laboratory for Atmospheric Physics at the University of Colorado. They do spacecraft. That's a target. There's 5 targets in Boulder. We don't really need to attack Boulder with 9 nuclear weapons. Military would attack it with 2 each on each target to make sure they killed it. You can just take one of them and knock out most of that. So you don't have to have overkill.
Two nuclear weapons on each target they would use.
Right, that's what they would do.
Jesus Christ.
To make sure that they killed the target. It's a sure destruction.
Yeah.
Doesn't.
It seems like a lot of besides the nuclear weapons themselves, it seems like a lot of the reason for the buildup of nuclear arms without thinking long term what's going to happen to your own country and the planet as a whole is from lack of trust and lack of communication and openness. And I think we're past the point of things like global policy for nuclear weapons being a local thing, because nothing is local anymore. Everything is global with the weapons that we have, with communication, social media. And you see this happening in Russia right now, where the move from the United States and other countries, and also Russia, is to wall off the media from the other person, from the other country. So Russia wants their people in the dark because it's easier to spread propaganda, and there's not a lot of communication going into the country. And then the United States is also feeding into Russia's policy, what Russia wants, by taking down Russian podcasts on Spotify, by demoting posts on Facebook that, may possibly have Russian propaganda. And the way that I look at it, my unexpert opinion is that propaganda is going to happen. Keep the lines of communication open and allow people to sort it out for themselves. Let people do the work of, okay, is this propaganda? Is this facts? Shit's going to get mixed up anyway. But when you completely close lines of communication and you're in the dark, that allows you to imagine the worst case scenario. I think the lack of knowledge is better than having, or the lack of knowledge is much worse than having convoluted knowledge, because you'll have smart people in both countries that will be able to decipher the things that are going on, hopefully.
Sure. I mean, you can see around the world at the moment that there's all these dictatorships that are developing. They all claim to be democracies. Then the dictator comes in and starts manipulating who can vote. Putin did this long ago. He got rid of all the elections for governors and things like that, and so he could appoint them all. So you gain control of the whole structure. You shut down the free press. Pretty soon everybody's afraid to challenge you. And this is happening all over the world in various dictatorships. So for a long time we had the rise of democracies, and it appeared that if people were given freedom and allowed to challenge their political systems, that they were happier and healthier, and that's certainly true in the strong democracies in the world. But lots of other countries which weren't that strong, became dictatorships. You can see them all over the place, like Venezuela, Belarus, and various other places. So that's certainly an important issue to control, as to how to prevent these dictatorships from continuing to grow. And you can see in the last election involving Trump, we had the same thing. It was an attempt to overthrow the government and create a dictatorship, and that hasn't ended. We've still got that going on. And it's interesting, how do people, the average person doesn't really know what's going on. They have a trouble separating fact from fiction, and some of them will believe really things that are just hard to really understand or believe. So why are people so gullible? I don't know. And why why are flim flam men so successful at bilking people out of their money? And there's all these little old ladies get called up all the time on the telephone, and they'll tell them their Social Security number and give them money. So people are good-hearted, and they want to believe what they're told, and people take advantage of that.
I think so with social media, I think that most people in day-to-day life have a decent bullshit filter to varying degrees, but most people can detect bullshit. With social media, you have some of the smartest people in the country and some of the smartest people on the planet that are being paid hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars a year to create an algorithm that is going to manipulate your human nature against you. So I don't think it's that people are very gullible or are becoming more gullible. I think it's that these algorithms are transforming the actual hardwiring in which people take in information, because it's incentivizing the companies are incentivized to keep people on the platform, and one of the ways that you do that is you keep feeding people what they want. So if you click on something with misinformation, you will be rewarded by the company in the form of more misinformation or more things that have to do with that topic. There's no sort of shakeup in the algorithm which goes, hey, you've been looking at the fact that, Trump is a Russian agent for the past 2 weeks. Here's an article that's the counter point of view. Or you've been looking at a lot of pro-nuclear arms articles. Take a look at this. There's nothing built into the algorithm that allows for that. And it's because it's not in their best financial interest. It's best short term for the investors to have people engage on the platform for a longer period of time, no matter what. So it's hard to separate the information from the algorithm, because that's how we consume almost all of our information today. Mm-hmm. But I think generally people have a pretty good filter of, okay, if you give me everything, I can have somewhat of an instinct of what is true and what's not. But then you're not presented with alternate forms of thinking, and you have echo chambers in your own life, like physically with the people that you hang around, and then digitally with the landscape that you've built around yourself and that these companies have cocooned you in. It's very hard to break out of that thinking.
Right. I think it's partly that. I think it's also partly that there's a lot of name calling going on, and at least in the United States. Like Republicans can't finish a sentence without attacking Democrats for being communists or something like that. It's a colored word, constant bombardment. And liberals are just as guilty probably for the same thing. But these people in your community. Generally, if you take the time to meet them, they're perfectly rational people, and they're all perfectly nice. And I have nothing against Republicans. I'm not or Democrats either. I'm an independent myself. So I think a lot of this name calling is very poisonous in a society. I mean, most people actually want the same thing. If you meet people around the world, and I know lots of people from China and different countries, and you meet them all the time in science meetings and things like that. They're all basically want the same things that everybody else wants in the United States. They want their children to grow up healthy and, to live good lives. They all want to be peaceful, and they all want to enjoy themselves doing the same general kinds of things, seeing the world or going to a party or whatever they want to do. And, there's not really that huge divergence what people want. They just disagree a little bit on the way of achieving it. And so there are various moral and other kinds of issues, religious issues that affect the way people want to think about these things. But those are really not about the fundamental goal. They're more about the method of getting to the goal. And, so some of these are just intractable problems because they involve some political or religious or other idea. But I wish people would stop calling each other names. But while we're on the point of the press, here's another interesting thing. So I'm not sure how many of your listeners would know that the United Nations has actually banned nuclear weapons. So the nuclear weapons are now in the same category as landmines and chemical weapons and biological weapons. It is illegal to have them, and it is illegal to tell other countries how to make them. There's a whole series of things that are illegal connected with nuclear weapons. And so this was ratified in the United Nations about a year ago, and voted on by enough countries around the world to put it into place. Of course, none of the nuclear weapon states signed on to this, and none of the countries that are protected by the nuclear weapon states signed on to it. And so there's a mechanism there to get rid of the nuclear weapons by trying to get the countries around the world to actually follow this legal precedent from the United Nations. Of course, you can see today the news is a fight in Ukraine and Russia about chemical weapons, which have been banned for a long time. And, there were chemical weapons production facilities in Russia and in the Soviet Union, and apparently in the Ukraine, left over from when they were a part of the Soviet Union. Those things have been banned for decades. And, certainly the United States is not making chemical weapons or biological weapons. I don't think Ukraine is either. But so this is another one of these things where Russia's claiming Ukraine is making them, and then there's the fear, well, Russia has them because they're making this claim so that they feel that they can use them to defend themselves from the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
So that's very confusing.
Yeah, I saw there's an interview with a actual, I think she was a Russian spy that actually managed to get into the government, infiltrated the U.S. government, and she was actually being interviewed. I can't remember if it was, I think it was BBC recently, and she was saying that Ukraine was blowing themselves up, like they were doing this to themselves. It's not Russia. And like the seriousness of how she was saying it, and I really couldn't tell if she genuinely believed it, because the propaganda is so strong. If she's, obviously making things up out of her ass, but it's incredible to see how different people are viewing the conflict that's happening right now between Russia and Ukraine, because we see what we see because we have the freedom to post things on social media. We have Facebook, we have Twitter, and yes, there's a lot of disinformation, but there's a lot of good information out there too. And then what's happening in Russia right now, where there's no Twitter, no Facebook, YouTube may go. Most American-based social media companies are gone, if not already have left. And so it's that was just like a crazy moment for me, seeing this woman on TV be like, yeah, Ukraine's doing it to themselves. Like they're blowing themselves up.
I'm not sure what blow up means, but I mean, there is a series of confusions about why is Putin invading the Ukraine? Is he trying to regain the ancient Soviet Union, in which case he's going to start invading the Baltic states and other states? Or is he mad at the Ukrainians because they arrested one of his friends? There's a Ukrainian oligarch there whose daughter is a godchild of Putin. And so they arrested this guy in Ukraine a year or so ago because of charges that he was involved in graft and things like that. And is that why? Is that what it's about? Is it about the fact that Ukrainians don't just do whatever Russia wants? It's hard to know what this war is about.
I don't even think Putin knows what it's about. I think you probably made a decision to do this weeks ago, and then he's working on the fly, coming up with new reasons why he should be there. Because first it was NATO, then it was Nazis. There's a Holocaust going on in Ukraine, and he's stopping it. Now they're blowing themselves up and trying to get reinforcement. So it's crazy to think that everyone's human. Everyone has ego. Everyone gets jealous. Did Putin do this because Zelensky, banged his ex-girlfriend or something? Like literally, if you have this much power, you can enforce it however you want. And when nuclear weapons go into play, it's not outside the possibility that this world could possibly be ended on an ego trip or something like that, like a moment of just insane curiosity. And I don't know what to think of it. I agree. I don't know why Putin is doing this. I've been trying to listen to different podcasts and look at explanations, and it's very unclear. And maybe he is confused as to why he's there as well, but he's already started it, so he doesn't want to be viewed as weak and not finish what he started.
Right. Unfortunately, that's the kind of the case here. We don't know what Putin wants or why he did this.
Yeah.
And so we can't see how it's going to end.
Yeah. And that goes off of the lack of communication too. Like I wanted to ask you, so if there was a legitimate threat that a nuclear strike on the United States, let's say, a couple months from now, this continues to escalate and there's a war in which the U.S. is involved, and we have credible information that there will be a nuclear strike on the U.S., an imminent threat, and you had 15 minutes to be in a room with Vladimir Putin to say whatever you wanted to him. You just had 15 minutes. What are some of the main things that you would hit on?
Well, I would certainly tell him that he couldn't attack the United States without having Russia left as a smoldering ruin. And even if we didn't attack back with missiles and make it a smoldering ruin, the smoke from burning the American cities would destroy his agriculture. He's in the most vulnerable city or country in the world for agricultural disruptions. He could lose a huge fraction of the Russian population for doing such a thing. And I'd also point out that it's, if you read Gorbachev's comments, for example, Gorbachev, who's not popular in Russia, I don't think, but nevertheless, he's a very articulate, well-spoken person, and I've heard many Russians. I know Russians. They're intelligent, well-educated people. They have an interesting sense of humor, and they have a moral sense. Many of them have a religious foundation, and they have strong morals. And I think Putin actually himself is a very religious person. I think it's unlikely that God would really want him to, kill off a large fraction of the population of the earth just because he's pissed off about something.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like in order for you to get through to someone like Putin in that moment, you would have to know truly why he's there, because he knows all these things. He knows that if he launches a nuke at someone like the United States, that means his entire country and people are blown off the map. But in that instance, he's not thinking rationally. So you have to be able to have some sort of insight into the emotions of what he's going through. If there was some breakthrough moment where finally, this is it. Like, if you think this is going to solve it, it's actually not in your best interest. And here's why. Because the information's out there. I'm sure Putin has a general understanding of how screwed Russia would be if he launched a nuclear attack. But in that moment of an imminent nuclear strike, it seems like the best approach would have to be like a pure emotional, like, you think you want this, you don't, just tell me what's going through your mind right now, like almost a therapy session with the world on the line, the most intense, high-stakes therapy session of all time.
Yeah, or maybe he could just go talk to his wife.
Maybe, yeah. That's a possibility. So I wanted to go back to the nuclear winter for a bit. Is there any truth to the claims that nuclear winter is overblown, the effects of it are overblown, and it's more of a nuclear autumn, that it wouldn't actually cause as much destruction as scientists say?
So nuclear fall was a product of a paper that Steve Schneider and Starley Thompson wrote in the 1980s, I believe, to a journal called Foreign Affairs. So it was not published in a science journal where people could have reviewed it and said whether it made sense. So in the 1980s, the climate models were very simple. I mean, your iPhone or Android, whatever kind of phone you have, has got more computer power than the computers did in the 1980s. And so climate models back then had very shallow tops, and you couldn't afford to simulate the climate for very long. And so in the case of the paper that they wrote, the top of the model was about 20 kilometers above the surface, so the smoke couldn't really rise. and they could only afford to simulate 20 days. Not run the computer 20 days. They could only afford to simulate, half of October or something like that. So what is fall? Is fall October? Well, there's nothing growing anymore in October. Is fall November? Some of the fall, there's snow on the ground.
Yeah.
For sure nothing is growing.
Yeah.
Or is it September? There's a little bit of September in there. Maybe you're picking a few leftover fruits or something like that. And so they couldn't actually even simulate what they were talking about. The coldest temperatures actually in models now occur about 3 years after the war starts. The temperature dropped very rapidly, but they continue to cool for years. It is not a 20-day kind of calculation that it can be done there. So I think that was just an inappropriate calculation. There was a lot of Steve was mad because Carl Sagan was more famous than Steve was. And so there was some personal stuff going on there, and which is a little unfortunate. And, and in the end, Steve actually, I think, wrote a blurb on the cover of Carl's book as well. So Carl Sagan and Rich Shurker wrote a book called The Path Where No Man Thought. And on the back of it, I believe Steve has also got another thing saying how great nuclear winter is and how important it is. And yes, it's correct. And so I knew Steve pretty well. We were about the same age. And I think Steve regretted that ever bringing that word up. But it was leaped upon by the merchants of doubt.
Yeah, that.
I should say, we've done so nobody did these calculations after about 1990 because the Soviet Union integrated. So Alan Roebuck did one in 2007 with a modern climate model that came from NASA, and he found that it was worse than people thought in the 1980s because the smoke could go up to kilometers. We redid it with the National Center for Atmospheric Research climate model, which we've been using in the last few years, which shows almost the same results as the 2007 NASA model. It's been redone in the India-Pakistan context with a model from Switzerland and another model from, I think it's Sweden. So this calculation has been done now with multiple different models. They all show the same result.
I recently did a 360 audio and video immersive experience, augmented reality, and part of the experience was going through a post-apocalyptic world. And I wanted to ask you, beyond the cold calculated models of nuclear winter, what would people see if they were walking through a world where a nuclear winter was going on with their senses? What would the sky look like? Would the air smell different? Like I was just wondering, from a sensory standpoint, what do you imagine a nuclear winter to feel like if you were to make that into a model of augmented reality that people could actually experience?
Sure. Well, you can see this now if you're in a place where smoke from large remote fires come over you. So around in Colorado, for example, we've had several years with fires in the west blanketing us with smoke. Sometimes you can smell it because it's a low altitude, but usually it's high above us, and so you just see it as a gray haze. So it makes the atmosphere look gray and washed out. The fires after a nuclear winter are only going to last weeks or something like that for a short period of time. And so the smoke at low levels is going to go away. And of course, there's all kinds of nasty pyrotoxins in the smoke. And lots of people get sick from the smoke from burning cities, and this burning plastics and stuff is deadly. So a lot of people actually get sick from the smoke. But nevertheless, after a while, it would just make the skies would just look gray. and it would feel like a heavily overcast day at the surface. There wouldn't be distinct bright sun, and shadows would be washed out, and it would be cold. It would, the temperatures would drop below freezing. There'd be snow on the ground, and the snow on the ground probably wouldn't go away for a couple of years. So every time you walk outside, the temperatures we're talking about here are colder than the last ice age. So it would be miserable temperature-wise. So I used to draw this analogy: what would happen if there was an asteroid impact now, or a nuclear conflict?
Yeah.
And let's take the asteroid example here, because it's a little less damaging locally. If there was an asteroid impact, you could run into a parking garage or something like that.
Yeah.
You can't see the sky. So then the fires.
That's funny. That's funny to hear an asteroid as the second worst option.
Yeah. Right. Well, if there was a nuclear war, probably the parking garage would drop down your head.
Yeah.
At any rate, you want to get away from the original blast or bright glowing sky from fires or whatever it is. And okay, so you're in this parking garage and you've protected yourself, and you waited there for a few days or whatever it is. So the radiation didn't kill you. Okay, but you go outside and there's no power anymore. So there's no electricity. There's no gasoline to be had. There's no fuel to, power your furnace. The temperatures are dropping. The temperatures drop every night. So it's not like it's a mystery. You shut off the sun, the temperatures drop. Mm-hmm. Just get colder and colder. And, so you can't call mom and ask her what to do because the phones don't work. There's nobody bringing food to where you are. There's a lot of people that are hurt around you, and probably a lot of wounded animals, lots of debris left over from burning everything, so it would feel, really dirty and miserable. You couldn't go take a shower and anything like that because there wouldn't be hot water, or probably any water pressure because there's no electricity to run the pumps. So, you'd be in a really difficult situation of just trying to find some clean water, something to eat, something to keep yourself warm. So you'd be immediately thrust into a survival situation, pretty much by yourself, probably, where it'd be hard to find other people. Depending on whether maybe you live with friends, you all survive together or something, and you work as a band. But nevertheless, there's going to be a lot of other people out there looking for food, and there's not going to be any food. This is one of the things, like the numbers I told you from the number of people who died. That was kind of optimistic because it takes a certain number of calories for people to eat just to maintain bodily functions. And so if you have the minimum number of calories given to some people and everybody else gets nothing. So some people get nothing and everybody else gets just enough to survive. Then you end up with 5 billion people dead and 1.5 billion left or something. However, those people who don't get anything are probably not going to like that. Maybe they're dead from the nuclear war, but more likely they're going to come and try to take your calories. And then you're all going to be on not enough calories to live. So there's going to be huge battles over food and every other resource you need. The people who are not in a combat zone would be better off. New Zealand, for example, is far away from the combat zone. It'd still be dark there. They still lose a lot of sunlight. But if you live in New Zealand, mostly you grow sheep, and the sheep eat grass. You wouldn't kill all the grass, so you could probably keep enough sheep there to, they export most of the sheep. And so you probably could continue to grow enough sheep to eat. So there might be some little pockets around the world where there's still enough food to eat. But in New Zealand, they don't have big industries to make things. So pretty soon their generators would fail. They wouldn't be able to make electricity. They wouldn't be able to import fuel. They'd lose all the things that depended on technology. So they'd still be forced back into a primitive agricultural existence. So this would be like going back to before people had tractors. They had to farm with an animal, and no fertilizer and things like that. And the conditions for farming were not very good. You can't support a very big population like that.
Yeah. So hair trigger alert is something that I've seen it seems like it's pretty highly debated within the topic of nuclear weapons. Would you be able to describe what hair trigger alert is and your thoughts on whether we should have that mechanism or not?
Well, the hair trigger alert basically means that if you don't launch your weapons, they're going to be blown up within a few minutes. So then you won't be able to launch your weapons. And of course, the fallacy of this is that we have all these weapons sitting out there in submarines. And, we could take airplanes off. There are airplanes on standby all the time, ready to take off to protect their weapons. So there'd still be plenty of weapons left to attack the enemy, even if you lost your ground-based missiles. And of course, the United States has ground-based missiles sitting in silos. You know exactly where they are. You can drive to the freeway and see them. Go look on the web, you can find out exactly where they are. So those are easy targets. The Russians have theirs on these mobile trucks. They're much more difficult to destroy because they would immediately drive them around away from where they were, and so you wouldn't know where they were anymore. It'd be harder to destroy. At any rate, the hair trigger just refers to the fact that you have something to protect your own missiles, and you only have 20 minutes at the most to protect them. And therefore, you have to decide to launch those missiles in a very short period of time. But that's just a fallacy, because even if those missiles are destroyed, you have plenty left. So you don't have to use them.
So your TED Talk, which is titled, "I've Studied Nuclear War for 35 Years, You Should Be Worried." So back in mid-February, it had about 3.5-4 million views, and now it has nearly 7 million. I think when I watched it, it was 6.5, 6.6, and it's already gone up. What are some of the common concerns people have said when they reach out to you that are watching this video about the possibility of nuclear war and the fallout? What are the common threads that people are bringing up when they send you a message or reach out?
Well, not many people send me messages, fortunately. A lot of people take a lot of
just me. Just me.
There are a huge string of messages there, which are very interesting to look at. So it used to be a year or so ago that most of the messages were something like, "Oh, this guy mentioned an assault rifle. I'm not even going to watch this show." So I said that the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs was like having Mount Everest hit the Earth at 10 times the speed of a bullet from an assault rifle. And it is 10 times. There's a known rifle speed that's the fastest bullet that you can make, and that is about the speed of this mountain that ran into the Earth. And so lots of people object to that. And then lots of people said, well, how can this be bad? We had 500-600 above ground nuclear weapons tests, and it didn't cause a nuclear winter. How could that be? And the answer to that is that the people who exploded the bombs knew they'd start fires, so they blew them up in deserts or islands that didn't have anything on them to burn. And so that's the answer to that. So there are a lot of comments like that, or there's some ones like, "Well, why'd you waste 35 years on this?" Or, "There haven't been any nuclear wars, so how could you spend 35 years studying it?" And of course, there was a nuclear war. The Second World War was a nuclear war. 2 atomic weapons were used.
Yeah.
And it's a complicated problem, and so we know a lot from all those weapons tests. So that's the answer to that. However, in the last month, the comments have changed. And so there's quite a few comments that are along the lines of, "I've been studying nuclear war for 5 days, and I am worried." So I thought that was pretty funny and correct. And, there's a few people who act very worried. I've gotten emails from people from Slovakia, for example. "I'm afraid there's going to be a nuclear war. I'm right in the middle of all the place. What should I do? Where should I move, Africa or South America?" And, I say, well, I wouldn't move. Well, first thing I say is not very likely there's going to be a nuclear war unless there's some stupid mistake. But, I wouldn't move to Africa because there's already food insecurity there. Maybe Costa Rica, But, there's a lot of South America that's going to have food problems. I moved to New Zealand or Australia. And then I have mail from people from New Zealand. Is the radiation from the war going to drift over New Zealand and poison everybody? And I say, well, nobody has investigated that for about 40 years. No one has published a paper on this in a really long time. And so I said, well, I'm not really sure what the answer is because nobody has really studied this. And in actual fact, it depends on whether nuclear reactors get blown up. That's really a danger in Ukraine, is having one of these reactors. They have 15 nuclear reactors. And the amount of long-lived isotopes in nuclear reactors is much greater than in a typical bomb. So those kind of things could spread all over the earth. And this is what was happening in the early 1960s. When I was a kid, for example, my mother said, okay, you can't drink any more milk because strontium-90 is being concentrated by cows eating grass with nuclear debris on it. And in fact, it was found to be...
Nuclear cows.
Yeah, well, it was found to be getting in children's teeth. You could look at their baby teeth. See there was strontium-90 collecting there and in bones and stuff. And so there is a concern about that, but probably the amount of those isotopes released is not really... People have this image from On the Beach, the movie, in which the submarine surfaces in San Francisco and the whole city is still standing there undamaged, but everybody's dead because of nuclear radiation. That's highly unlikely to ever happen. But if there were a nuclear explosion or even a mild explosion near a reactor, you could destroy that and it could distribute radiation over a wide area, like Chernobyl is like that. There's like a very large area around Chernobyl and Fukushima in Japan, where people are not allowed to go anymore because the radiation levels are about twice the background levels. So you could, over your lifetime, accumulate some problems from that.
Yeah, in terms of the nuclear reactors, Russia possibly blowing them up in Ukraine, I was listening to a show called Breaking Points with Crystal and Sagar, which is about the only political show I listen to. But I heard them say this morning that Russia is most likely occupying these nuclear sites to control the power over Ukraine, to control their power supply, to have more leverage in the future. And that as long as there's cold water over the fusion rods, so even if the power goes out, you're pretty much good. And that most people don't think that Russia would actually be stupid enough to blow up the nuclear reactors.
Absolutely, because the debris would probably blow over Russia. So the Russians would be incredibly dumb to blow up one of those reactors. And probably the Russians built the Ukrainian reactors, or the Soviets built the reactors in the Ukraine. So the Russians are probably familiar with the designs of these reactors. They have a lot of them themselves. They probably know how to keep them running. And their real goal there, as you say, is probably to turn the power off. So they can starve the Ukrainians by turning off the power and preventing food from being brought into the cities. That's a way to control the war. People have been doing this for hundreds of years, laying siege to cities by not letting food go in and not letting people come out and waiting for them to starve to death and give up.
So you've mentioned working with Carl Sagan a few times, and you earned your PhD in physics under him, correct?
Yes.
So obviously, Carl Sagan, he's one of the most renowned scientists and science communicators of all time. What was it like working alongside him and having him as a resource? What was he like, both as a scientist and also as a person to talk to?
Well, Carl was a very friendly guy, and he was very busy when I worked with him because he was busy with his TV show and other kinds of things. And so I'd stand by the elevator, wait for him to go down the elevator. I could talk to him for about 5 minutes before he rushed off to his airplane or something like that. But no, he was a very friendly, personable type guy. There was a biography written of Carl in the early days of planetary exploration. The person who wrote the article said, meeting Carl was like meeting a talking horse. And I thought about that for a while. And, Carl was unusual in the sense that, most science people would reject things that they thought were ridiculous. And Carl would go and study them. So like aliens, okay, everybody's still excited about aliens. Are they visiting the Earth? Most science people said, well, it's not very likely they're wasting their time hiding out on the Earth. If they were going to come here, they'd probably just say, okay, here we are. We know all this stuff you don't know. Let us help you out. Or they'd say, oh, you look pretty good. You have lots of resources. We're going to take them, one or the other. Hiding out doesn't make much sense. And at any rate, Carl wrote a whole book about it. We got all kinds of people together, and they investigated the various issues involved and how they would be detected and what these sightings might really be. And so he actually investigated it, and he did that for a bunch of other things. So he was very open-minded, and if you read his books, he wrote books about how the brain works and all kinds of other things that weren't really things he studied. And he had an unusual background. He went to the University of Chicago as an undergraduate, and at the time there, they read the great books. So he learned a lot about literature from reading the great books. And although it wasn't a great book, I remember one time I read one of his books. It was a little paperback, not very long, and in the middle of it, there was a picture of a bunch of people walking in a ring with umbrellas. And I thought, what has this got to do with this book, which was about some planetary science problem? And so finally I said, Carl, why do you have this picture of these people with the umbrella? And he said, oh, that's because their theory was all wet. And I thought, wow, that was pretty obscure. And then I came to discover how this book was written. So Carl didn't sit down and write things. He dictated them. So he was telling stories orally all the time. And in this particular book, he'd been in the Jet Propulsion Laboratory on a planetary mission. He was driving back across the country in a Porsche with his wife and a child in the car, who I don't think was very old. And he wrote the book driving across the country in the Porsche.
Wow.
And if you tried to write a book by driving across the country in a Porsche with a young child, it's not likely to help you write the book.
Just paying attention on the road and driving the Porsche with a child in a car is a huge feat. So writing an entire book is definitely next level.
Right. And, if you brought up something to Carl, an idea, he would likely respond in some way you would have never imagined. He would likely come up with some other idea that, made you think about it. It was probably a silly idea. A lot of his ideas didn't make much sense. They were just something inconsistent or wrong with them or something like that. But he had a lot of ideas, so he was constantly generating ideas, and some of them were good ideas.
Do you think he was generating so many ideas in an effort to push the boundaries of the idea that was presented to him? I've interviewed a bunch of music artists, and something that a lot of music artists do, everyone has their own spectrum of creativity, but you want to create a lot of music. You want to make a lot of bad songs so that you have a higher chance of making a good song, and the bad songs also teach you how to make something that people are going to like, how to make something that's catchy. Is that an approach that's parallel to how Carl Sagan thought about ideas, where even if this idea is wrong, it may cause me to think about something in a different way, or it may cause the person I'm talking to tell me something, prompt a discussion?
Yes, I think that's all true. And I think he had a broad range of interests. So he saw connections that many people wouldn't see because he had thought about all these different things that were, looked unrelated, but he could see some relations between them. And so he was trying to generate ideas. And, Carl was a teacher. That's what he was really, I think, one of the great teachers of history, and he taught huge numbers of people about various things. And, I know many people who wrote him a letter and he responded, and they consequently went into science or, did something in response to Carl communicating with them. So he's very successful at that. And, I spent a lot of time working with Jim Pollack, who was one of Carl's major collaborators. And Pollack had been Carl's first student, and he was the opposite of Carl. He was a very thorough, detail-oriented person. And so between them, they had a lot of ideas, and they worked out a lot of detailed responses. But, Carl was not a detailed guy. He was going to go work out the details. But, Carl inspired lots of people to go do interesting things. If you go look at his papers, he has huge range of collaborators and people who wrote papers with him on all kinds of topics. And, I wrote several papers with Carl that he became first author of, that he wrote hardly anything of. And they're still widely quoted because people think Carl wrote them instead of me. And so that's interesting. And
it seems like the type of person, as you describe, Carl Sagan, a generalist. He's obviously has a huge range of knowledge within certain areas, but he also had a wide range of interests. It seems like that type of thinking is becoming less and less popular. And I grew up playing baseball, so that there's a very early pressure to specialize in what you're good at, especially in sports. And then when you go to college, it's all right, pick your major. By the time you're freshman, by the first semester sophomore year, and this is what you're going to do for a very long time. It's not as popular to say, okay, have an area of focus where you become incredibly competent and knowledgeable, but then keep, maybe 10%, 20% of your time open to explore other ideas that maybe are unrelated, and the only thing that you get out of it is that it's fun to do, fun to study, but also you may make connections down the line that you never would have thought at the time that will help you in your focused field.
Yeah, well, Carl was a baseball player too, and he was proud of that. But I think he just had a huge range of experiences, and he met so many people. And at the time, we were in the middle of the Cold War, and practically the only way that the United States and Russia had any intersection was through the space program. So Carl spent a lot of time working with Russian planetary scientists. There were lots of Russians that came to Cornell and gave talks, and you had to go out to dinner with and meet. Some of them were still alive, actually. And, so he was enriched because of all the people he met all over the world as well. And he was, I remember one time he came out to talk about something about nuclear winter, and we were trying to figure out where to go out to dinner. And so I organized a dinner at a Japanese restaurant that had these little separated rooms, so we were sitting in this room with, maybe 6 of us or something like that. And you could see Carl was smiling and waving at somebody all through the dinner, and turned up to be some little kid about 6 or 8 years old who recognized Carl. Carl, of course, went over and signed something for him or said hello to him. So that was a constant thing with him. He liked meeting people and was very outgoing.
Yeah, he has that great quote that goes, the nuclear arms race is like 2 sworn enemies standing waist deep in gasoline, one with 3 matches and the other with 5. It seems like a big part of the problem, or a big part of the potential solution to the nuclear arms race and humanity not blowing itself up, is to provide a path for global leaders and military personnel, decision makers, to see the gasoline. I feel like there's so much pressure on the shininess of the nuclear weapon and the instilling fear in your enemies and the mutually assured destruction, hair trigger, all that stuff we got into, that no one takes a second to look down and say, oh shit, like we're both standing in gasoline. If I drop this match, we're both going to go up in flames eventually.
Yeah, why in the world why did people build 70,000 nuclear weapons? Just unthinkable. I mean, the number of like 10 weapons on every target in the world or something. Just no point to it. It was, why? Is it just about money? Was it about race? What was the motivating factor for that is very unclear.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's the same reason that people buy a lot of shoes. Before the pandemic, I had about 30 pairs of shoes and I wore maybe 5 of them, but I was just every few months I would buy another pair of shoes, and over 4 or 5 years, I now have an entire shoe rack that's full of shoes. And now, ironically, I wear barefoot walking shoes, which aren't even shoes. And I had a lot of time to sit around, obviously, and think about why I made these purchases when everything was closed down. And the only thing I could think of is that when you have something new, when you create something new, it makes you feel good. You get that little boost, but then it's just something to look at. So maybe there's an element to building up this nuclear arsenal. Obviously, there's a ton of convoluted things and forces that go into why a country builds up a nuclear arsenal, and that's happened over decades. But it is something cool to look at. Like, it's cool for Putin or Trump or Biden, whoever, to go out to dinner and be like, hey, I just picked up this, this new warhead. We got it. I could show you in the hangar. Like, we got it. You could see it after dinner or something. Like, you would talk about buying a new car with your friends. I feel like there is a showing off, dick measuring contest, as they would say, which is a totally human trait. I do it. A lot of people do it. It's just you want people to know what you have. You want to be able to show it off.
Sure. People who build bombs are, I think there's 12,000 scientists at Los Alamos or something like that. Of course, they're not all building bombs or all kinds of other things in society. But, there's certainly a feeling of competitiveness there and knowing what's going on. And, if you're in the know, then it makes you feel good. And, oh, well, let's see, maybe we could build this new thing nobody ever built before. It's a challenge. And, these are not about being evil or something like that. It's just human nature to want to compete in your job and do the best job you can, whatever the job is. And so there's a lot to be said for that. And even during the pandemic, I can see lots, Amazon really made this possible. You can go to the web, and if you're bored one day, you buy something for almost nothing and you get it in the mail and think, oh, wow, I got this. So it makes you feel temporarily good against all the oppressiveness of the world.
There'll be a nuclear section pretty soon. Right. We keep going in the same direction. It's a joke to buy nuclear weapons on Amazon, but does the democratization of nuclear technology scare you, where it may not be an accidental nuclear strike that kills us from a general making a decision or a certain person in the military? Does it worry you that nuclear technology may democratize itself to the point where it becomes cheap enough that the average, maybe not the average person, but like a rich person could build a nuclear bomb and a facility to launch it from?
Well, there's a whole bunch of questions there. I mean, in the Kennedy administration in the 60s, he was very concerned that the number of nuclear states would rapidly grow and the whole thing would get out of control. As long as the U.S. and Russia, that there was just two adversaries, they had two views, they could discuss them. But when you get people all over the world with nuclear weapons, they have different goals and different things happening. It's like, Pakistan and India are fighting over different things in the United States and Russia. And, there was, up until 1986, there was a new state every 5 years. And when the U.S. and Russia started building down their weapons, new states stopped forming. And at that point, actually, the Ukraine and Kazakhstan and South Africa had nuclear weapons. They all got rid of their nuclear weapons. Ukraine gave theirs back to Russia. And, that race started again in 1998 when India and Pakistan developed weapons, and then North Korea developed nuclear weapons. We're probably on the cusp of Iran developing nuclear weapons. That's really dangerous because when Iran gets a nuclear weapon, then Saudi Arabia and Egypt will get nuclear weapons. The Middle East is so complicated that you don't even know who's on whose side there. So that's just going to be a tinderbox. And we have this
Yeah.
problem now that people think that, like Ukraine, if they just kept their nuclear weapons, the Russians wouldn't have invaded them. The Russians weren't going to let the Ukrainians keep control of the weapons. The Ukrainians didn't have any control anyway. They were always under the Russian control. But, because of Libya, where Gaddafi gave up his program, which really didn't amount to much anyway, probably, and then he got killed, lots of people think, oh, I can't give up my nuclear weapons because my country will be invaded. Well, this is silly from all kinds of points of view. In the first place, why would the United States bother to invade North Korea? There's nothing we want from North Korea.
Yeah.
And, so we have no motivation to invade them. And if they just stop wasting their money on all those arms and invest in agriculture and open up their population to the rest of the world, they'd probably flourish like South Korea. And, the same thing is true of Iran. If they stop fighting all their neighbors, they'd probably be a wealthy country again. And, there's plenty of well-educated people in Iran. So, a lot of people don't do what's the best interest in their best interest here. And so, that can lead to an expansion of nuclear states. But if you look at the history of this, huge numbers of states wanted to become nuclear states. Brazil and Argentina had nuclear weapons programs. Switzerland had a nuclear weapons program. Sweden had a nuclear weapons program. I'm not sure about Switzerland, but I think they had one. Sweden definitely had one.
Yeah.
So there are all these countries all over the world that you'd never imagine. Like Sweden is, Nobel Prize, it's not peace, that's Norway, but nevertheless, you wouldn't think they'd have a nuclear weapons program. There were huge numbers all over the globe. And, they all banned in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when they thought that the U.S. and Russia were abandoning them and peace was breaking out.
So as we end off, I wanted to ask you a couple existential questions of the impossible to answer variety. So you've spent your life, a large chunk of your life, studying nuclear technology and the effect that it has on this planet and the people. And nuclear power can help save this planet, and nuclear weapons can destroy it. And you have the same process of atoms splitting apart that can be harnessed for either ultimate extreme. Is there something to be said about humanity and human nature with the direction that we've chosen to go so far with nuclear power?
Well, nuclear power, there's a big debate about nuclear power in terms of global warming. So there's one group of people who thinks that we should develop a new cycle of nuclear energy production, which produces fewer long-lived isotopes. So right now there's hundreds of thousands of tons of nuclear waste sitting around nuclear power plants that nobody knows what to do with. This stuff is going to be radioactive for 100,000 years. This is a big waste problem that's not being dealt with. But at any rate, so one group thinks we should build more nuclear power plants. The other group thinks we should build renewable energy, wind and solar and dams and ocean currents and stuff. And the nuclear people said, that's all impractical. We'd have to build all these facilities to do this, and we'll never get enough energy, and it's intermittent because there's day and night, and the wind doesn't always blow, and so on and so forth, which you can, and the renewable people say, well, we can just make hydrogen during the day and store that and use that as fuel. And so both sides are arguing about this. In my view, the answer hopefully will be the fusion. People will finally get their act together and make controllable fusion, which supposedly doesn't produce long-lived isotopes. It supposedly doesn't produce anything you make bombs out of. And you can not only solve the power problem forever, practically, but you could also solve the waste problem. You tear your trash and throw it in there. The high temperatures reduce it to atoms. You pile the atoms up, you make whatever you want out of it. So that doesn't seem to be happening. But I don't know how we're going to resolve this dilemma. But nuclear power is just not economical at the moment. And, people are terrified of it because of Fukushima and Chernobyl. But also, like Germany just decided not to use nuclear power anymore a few years ago. They've turned a bunch of their plants off. And because of now wanting to not use Russian fuel, they may have to turn them back on. So, this is a very complex issue, and, it's all tied up in what kind of cycle you use to make the power with, and can you ever make it so that it's competitive? And I think this was recognized in the Obama administration. The global warming problem was solved. We know there's global warming going on. We know why it's going on. We know roughly how much warmer it's going to get if you tell us how much CO2 you're going to release. People have been telling us the Earth would warm up by 2 degrees for doubling CO2 since the 1880s. The number has not changed since the 1880s. So we don't have to fight about the science. We need to fight about the solution. And the way to solve the solution is to make other sources of power economical, which they are now. So that's my nuclear power. I think it won't be economical.
So to end off, I wanted to bring up another Carl Sagan quote. And he says, the dumbing down of America is most evident in the slow decay of substantive content in the enormously influential media, 30-second sound bites, now down to 10 seconds or less. It's the lowest common denominator programming, credulous presentations on pseudoscience and superstition, but especially a kind of celebration of ignorance. I wanted to ask you, what insights or advice do you have for young people to rise against this celebration of influence, or celebration of ignorance, excuse me?
Yeah, well, this is a complicated problem to which there are many answers.
Yes,
I don't think
last question and last impossible question.
Right. Well, there's a lot of young people who are very well educated and determined to improve the world and things like that. So I think there's a famous quote, the world is all going to hell. Everybody just wants to make money. The politicians are all corrupt, and everybody wants to write a book. And this is a Chinese quote from, 1000 BC or something like that. So people have been thinking for a long time that the young people are not paying attention and don't want good things. And on the other hand, I think the world is there's so much communication now. And like when I was a kid, China was unapproachable. You couldn't go to China. It was unimaginable to communicate with people like that. And now I have all kinds of Chinese graduate students that go to China in an airplane and things like that. And so now on the radio, I hear about, there's an earthquake in China, and, huge number of people got killed. There's an earthquake in Turkey. There's an earthquake in Iran. There's a hurricane here. There's a hurricane there. There's rioting going on here. These people in Iowa City are complaining about something, so there is an information overload. It's very hard to respond to things because they have such short information cycles. It's like the UN banning nuclear weapons wasn't even publicized in the United States. I think only one newspaper even reported it. On the other hand, I think there is an aspect of the press which is bad. You already mentioned that there are a lot of people there that are saying things they probably don't even believe just to make money, and that there's a self-feedback system to prey on people's lack of information, that all of which is bad. But there's also just things like, I know that there are TV shows in which, I remember one about a cat, so there's a white panther stalking the United States. And this is, some kind of invasion of giant cats. And so they had this big debate about it. And then some guy comes in and he says, this is just a photograph of a house cat. And, it just looks like a big cat because of the way you've got it pictured against its surroundings. You would think that'd be the end of the show. No, that's not the end of the show. They return back to it as if it's a controversy that's unsolved. There's a thing like Bigfoot. When I was a kid, Yetis were a big thing. And, there are all kinds of magazine articles about Yetis. Had a list of all kinds of things I was interested in as a kid, to solve. And they discovered, no, there really weren't any Yetis. The monks were just taking monkey skins and sewing them up into skull caps to make it look like they were Yetis, and they were faking footprints in the snow. So it was just a scam. And so that should have been the end of that problem. But no, people like Yeti stories. I think it's fun.
Yeah.
And so, there's still Bigfoot somewhere.
Yeah.
We know there's no Bigfoot. Nobody can take a picture of Bigfoot. Every picture you ever see is fuzzy. Don't they have an iPhone like everybody else? No. This is fun.
Yeah.
So they maintain the story even though they know it's not true. So I think that's dangerous, actually. They should say, okay, this isn't true, but it's fun.
Yeah, it's fun until it's not.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, for hopping on the podcast. I've taken up too much of your time, and I know that people will get a lot of value out of what you've said. And these type of conversations, I hope people will listen to this and have a better understanding of what's going on in the world, and also the ramifications of things like nuclear power, nuclear weapons. And it's been a pleasure to speak with you and listening to you. So thank you so much.
Okay, well, I enjoyed the conversation, Zach, and I hope you have good luck with your show.
Of course. Thanks, Brian. Hey guys, this is a quick reminder to check out Auxoro Premium, the best deal in premium podcasting. On Auxoro Premium, you gain access to bonus episodes, the unlicensed therapy series, the ability to submit topic suggestions for the podcast, exclusive Ask Me Anything episodes, and the entire premium catalog for only $5 per month. Go to auxoro.supercast.com, that's AUXORO.supercast.com, to join the premium gang today.